Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
It was a very typical January day. Frosty, but not too frosty. The snowfall hadn't stopped for a week and the ground was covered in soft and fluffy snow. In short, it was a Sunday morning, perfect for a leisurely stroll in the park, provided, of course, that the park's paths were properly cleaned. James and Melissa knew of a nice little place not far from their house. They were used to walking there. They preferred to spend those rare moments when they were free from their work duties together, and they preferred to spend them in this park. From the outside, it seemed that this couple was absolutely happy, without needing anything. James, a big businessman who owned not a fabulous, of course, but quite a decent fortune, unlike many people, achieved it by his own hard work. He didn't have any special connections or rich parents. But he had a red diploma from one of the best universities in the city. Needless to say, he studied at the budget department, then worked at the factory as an engineer. James was well regarded by his superiors, and after a few years even got a promotion. But he wanted so much more. Leaving the factory, he took a job at a newly established computer firm, first as a simple office worker. There his talents were appreciated. His rapid career growth coincided with the growth of the company itself, and finally it became clear it was time for the company to expand. Its head office was moved to the capital, and branches began to open across the country. As for James, he was offered to head one of these divisions in his hometown. His office had become more spacious, and he had more responsibilities, as well as more money. He was happy with this state of affairs. And about halfway through his triumphant career climb, he met Melissa, a mere secretary working for his boss at the time. She, too, was moving up quite steadily, though not as fast as her husband-to-be. Anyway, both of them were quite satisfied with this state of affairs. The young people started dating and got married quite quickly. They just saw no point in delaying. It was clear to both of them that they were in love and could rely on each other. This is not a fleeting feeling that quickly disappears. After the night they spent together, it had been 5 years since the day the registry clerk had solemnly pronounced them husband and wife. And during this time, neither Melissa nor James was not disappointed in their choice. Of course, in their family sometimes there were conflicts, but what marriage is without it? The main thing is that each of them was resolved peacefully and calmly. It would seem that everything is fine, a good job, a good income, and a strong family. Only one circumstance significantly overshadowed the life of the couple. No matter how hard they tried to give birth to children, it did not work out. And no doctors could not say exactly in which of the spouses is the problem. To be more precise, from the medical point of view, there was no problem at all. They both seemed to be in perfect health. The only assumption the doctors could come up with was not at all comforting. Melissa and James were probably just incompatible in that respect. Of course, neither of them wanted to divorce because of this, because otherwise everything was fine. The spouses just lived on and hoped that sooner or later a miracle would happen. Meanwhile, work and joint walks in the park at least a little distracted from heavy thoughts. And suddenly the sleepy silence of Sunday morning was broken by a ringing child's voice. "Daddy, Daddy." James shuddered, but quickly pulled himself together, took Melissa's hand in his, and they continued their march along the snowy path. "Daddy." The shout came even closer than before. James got the strangest feeling, as if the unknown kid was addressing him specifically. He stopped, turned around. Melissa did the same. Now both of them stood looking at the strange scene unfolding right in front of them. There was indeed a boy heading towards them, a very young boy. He could hardly be given more than 7 years of age. But the most surprising thing was that he was dragging a pram behind him with great difficulty. Big, heavy, obviously uncomfortable for weak child hands in the snowy season. When he noticed that the couple he was following had stopped, he was finally able to catch his breath. The boy was not in a hurry to approach the couple, but was scrutinizing James's face. He's mistaken, James thought. Now he'll apologize and run off to find his real daddy. Who would ever think of leaving a child with a pram like that? But the boy didn't apologize or leave. He was still staring at the man standing in front of him, as if trying to understand something, or to catch some familiar features in his appearance. Finally, Melissa asked, "Baby, are you lost? Can I help you?" Hearing this, the kid seemed to come to his senses. He grabbed the pram, which he had let go of, and dragged it towards James. He didn't realize how the handle of the pram had ended up in his hand. "Daddy, I've been looking for you for so long," he said at last. "I grew up without you, but I don't want my little brother to either." James felt like he'd been hit over the head with something very heavy. His thoughts were jumbled. He realized that this was either some strange coincidence, a boy's mistake, or a hoax. But on the other hand, he wanted so much to believe that it was true, and that right now, by some miracle, he had become the father of 2 sons at once. And then something happened that immediately confirmed his worst fears. Journalists swooped in from all sides, camera flashes, inappropriate questions. James was already imagining the stories and headlines of tomorrow's newspapers. A well-known businessman cheating on his wife and abandoning his children, something like that. And a picture of him, confused and red, holding the proverbial pram by the handle, and next to that boy, some thin and ragged, and his wife in a state close to fainting. Then this vision was replaced by another, referring not to a supposed future, but to the very real past. "James, you've got to understand me," one of the department heads coaxed him in an ingratiating voice. "I made promises to serious people, and they don't forgive such things." In other words, you took a bribe, and now somehow you are sure that I approved it, and will help you in your illegal activities. Why so rude, James? Why the bribe in the first place? You see, before you took over the branch, that's the way we worked here. The people there are experienced, tried and tested. But what chance is there of any scoundrels from the street winning this competition? "Is that so, Mr. Terrence?" James said sternly. "How did you have it here before me? Forget it. I will act solely on the law and the internal regulations of the company. And if I find out about any shenanigans you try to pull that bypass me, the consequences for you will be dire." This was at the very beginning of his work in such a high position. Since then, he had had to have more than one such educational conversation, and he had to say goodbye to a couple of particularly uncomprehending employees. The whole structure James had to head seemed to be soaked in the spirit of bribery and nepotism. He understood perfectly well that such a state of affairs was not only dishonest and illegal. That would be half the problem. The main problem was that such things always have a negative impact on the quality of work. Therefore, his first task was to eradicate all this rubbish from the branch entrusted to him, not without resistance from both his subordinates and those in whose interests they acted. But James had succeeded in achieving his goal, and with it, he had indeed improved the company's performance. However, he realized that not everyone agreed with the new state of affairs. Perhaps it was these people who decided to set him up. However, James had another option. Who could arrange such a thing? A longtime competitor of their company, who also had a personal score with the head of the company. But was the word personal appropriate? The reason he was feuding was exactly the same. The company had become too good, looking under the new boss, which of course could not please a competitor who used to be the market leader in their field. Melissa's mind was not what she had in mind. Of course, on common sense, and she would have realized that it all looked extremely suspicious. Cameras, journalists. But it was hard to think clearly in such a situation, especially considering that she had been waiting and dreading such a development for quite some time now. "So the problem is me," she thought despondently. That explained everything, since she couldn't get pregnant, and James wanted children so badly. Of course, his only option was to get a mistress. She'd apparently succeeded, and so it was a natural outcome. Now her husband would probably ask for a divorce, and to tell the truth, she couldn't really be angry with him. She could understand James's feelings, which had led to the unpleasant scene that was now unfolding on the quiet park path. But there was something about the whole story that didn't make sense to her. To resolve this contradiction, she turned directly to the boy. "Why are you and your brother here alone? Where's your mummy?" She expected to hear perhaps anything but what the boy answered her. "She's dead," he said simply. His voice was steady, but Melissa noticed him furtively wiping away the tears that had gathered. A few days after baby brother showed up, my stepdad and I stayed behind. Except it's not good for us living with him. James looked at the child carefully and suddenly, even to himself, felt a pang of pity for him. Something terrible had to be going on at home for a 7-year-old to just take his brother and go off to the park, apparently in search of a better candidate to be their father. "What's your name?" he asked sympathetically. "Alex," the boy immediately replied, "and this is Stephen." "Well, what's to be done with you, Alex? Come with us, we'll sort it out." "And don't you want to consult me before you make decisions like that?" Melissa blurted out. For her, James's action was the clearest, most obvious proof that she'd got it right about the mistress and the kids. But it must have been completely out of her husband's mind that the unknown rival would die. That must be why he looked so confused. "Melissa," James sighed, "I understand what you might have thought. Believe me, sweetheart, it's absolutely not true, and it's hardly going to be that hard to prove it. But look at these kids now. They're clearly in a difficult situation. But can you just leave them without finding out what's going on and trying to help them?" Grudgingly, Melissa agreed. Her husband's words that there had been no cheating didn't seem particularly convincing, but he was clearly right about the children needing help. Anyway, it would be inhuman to leave the poor kid with the pram in the middle of the snow-covered park, so they walked backwards. Melissa kept close behind. James, on the other hand, pushed the pram confidently forward. Little Alex squirmed at his feet, sensing, obviously, that the man had treated him favorably, but there was still some hostility emanating from his wife. "You'll excuse me," the little man spoke after a while. "Don't think I'm with those reporters. I didn't even know they'd show up. It's embarrassing somehow. You must be in trouble now, huh?" "Never mind," James brushed it off. "I suspect they've been following me around all the time, hoping to find some dirt. And now, finally, they've had their luck. Still, I'd like to understand what makes you think I'm your father." "Well, how can I tell you?" Alex hesitated. "I saw you on television once. You were saying something boring about your company, I think." "Yeah, well, it happens," James agreed. So I recognized you. My mom had a photograph. She cared a lot about it. She would spend hours looking at it. Before my stepdad came along, she kept it in the most prominent place. And it was you in that picture." James tensed. He knew that Melissa was listening to every word they were saying, and he knew he'd only add to her suspicions with his next question. But he couldn't help asking, "What's your last name, Alex?" "Johnson's we," the boy replied, seeming mildly surprised. "Your mother's last name?" James clarified in an almost fallen voice, grasping for one last hope. "Yeah, Mom's last name." James felt his heart first skip a beat or two, then beat as often as if it were trying to correct this unfortunate mistake. He was sure he didn't just know Alex's mother. They'd been in a relationship with her a few years ago. Not a serious one, not a long one, but still intimate. And the boy's age appeared to be quite appropriate, too. "What? Familiar last name?" Melissa, who James had almost forgotten about from the shock, spoke up. "Familiar," he admitted. "You see, Melissa, apparently it's an ex-girlfriend of mine. It was a long time ago, before I met you, naturally. But I suspect Alex could turn out to be my son." Melissa hummed behind his back, either grudgingly or incredulously, or both. But what could he do? Was it really necessary to lie for her own peace of mind? The truth would have come out sooner or later and would have raised more questions and suspicions. Besides, that relationship was indeed in the distant past. The thoughts in Melissa's head were on a completely different path. The boy's explanation of how he'd found his supposed father seemed too far-fetched, too unrealistic. So what if he'd been born before she'd even met her husband? Maybe he'd been in contact with his old lover all along. Or maybe he met her recently and James' feelings were rekindled. There's a second one, why not? It's a realistic development. It was also disturbing that James had somehow accepted the idea that the boy could be his son. Yeah, and he dragged him to their house. After all, you could have called the police or the child welfare authorities there and let them deal with it. "No way," her husband replied stiffly when she brought it up. They'll stay with us until we find out the whole truth. It's for the best." "Who?" Melissa blurted out. "The kids," James retorted. "And I think you and I, too. We've been dreaming of having a baby, haven't we? Didn't we? And here we have two at once. Well, that's great." "Great," Melissa thought disappointedly. But she didn't say anything out loud. James seemed to refuse to understand what she was feeling. Even though she tried to fight her suspicions and didn't want to believe herself, the longer the children were in the house, the harder it became for her not to think about their mother, her husband's possible mistress. Meanwhile, James had taken a DNA test to find out for sure if Alex was his own son. And of course it was confirmed Melissa's husband had indeed turned out to be the father. "And what are you going to do about it?" quite venomously inquired the spouse. "Like what?" James wondered. "It's my son after all, so we should adopt him and raise him as our own. And his little brother too, of course. But why should they have to live with their stepfather?" Of course, leaving the children with a stranger was not something Melissa wanted to do either. For those few days that the boys lived in their house, Alex had managed to tell about him such things that gave the couple goosebumps. Constant drinking, fighting with the neighbors, and even abuse towards the elders. Definitely not the kind of environment in which children should be raised. But Melissa didn't understand why they had to take responsibility for the boys. There's child services. There are special people working there to save these poor destitute children. That's their job. Let them do it. To all these arguments, James could only answer one thing. "That's my own son. He's not yours." How do we know that, though? After all, the DNA test is only about Alex. "What are you implying?" James marveled. "Why would I want to do a test on Stephen too, when it's pretty clear that there's no way he could be my child?" "Why not? It doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe that's why you don't do the test, to hide the infidelity from me." They had conversations like this almost every day, but they gradually became less and less emotional. Melissa seemed to be starting to get used to her husband's decision. She was still somewhat distrustful of his assurances that he had never even thought of cheating, but it gradually ceased to seem such an important matter to her. After all, even if the boy's mother had been his mistress, she was dead now and could not interfere with their relationship, and the children were certainly not to blame for anything. And since Melissa couldn't have her own, why shouldn't she take care of these poor orphans? So the usual peace and quiet began to return to their home. Alex gradually thawed and got used to the new, well-fed and happy life. Looking at him, Melissa did not think about his mother anymore, but was only happy for the boy. Gradually, she was becoming a real mom to these children, and the adoption process initiated by James was well underway. But when it seemed that all the difficulties were over, a new problem arose. It came unexpectedly one warm spring day. Melissa was just putting the children to bed while James, relaxing after a hard day's work, watched television in the living room. It started with a knock on the door. Or should I say, banging. The word banging was too mild a word to describe what had happened. It was more like banging with all their might, probably using not only their fists, but also their feet, which were shod in heavy boots. All the more strange was the behavior of the intruder, because there was a bell button on the door, and it would have been difficult not to see it. Alex's face, when he heard the sounds, had gone completely pale. It even seemed to Melissa that it was not just a child's fright, which was quite natural in such a situation. No, it was as if this manner of behavior was very familiar to the boy and instilled real terror in his heart. Leaving him in the room with his younger brother, she ran out into the corridor. James was already there. Melissa could see that he was already holding a heavy metal shoe spoon when he peered through the peephole. To be honest, it occurred to her that it might be a good idea to arm herself with something. Little did she know who was standing outside the door, and for what purpose was trying so fiercely to sneak into their dwelling. "Who's there?" James asked loud and clear. The knocking stopped and a few agonizing seconds of silence followed. It seemed as if the intruder, having heard the shout, was now trying to remember who he was and why he was breaking into someone else's house. At last a voice came from behind the door, unpleasant, hoarse, and as if not quite sober. "Open up, there's something to do." "It's not my habit to open the door to anyone who knocks on it," James replied calmly. "Introduce yourself, please." What? Open the door or it'll be worse. You don't need to threaten me. Leave us alone or I'll call the police. What, the police? Call the police. The stranger suddenly cheered up. I'll tell them at once that you're a thief, and they'll take you away. Man, said James tiredly, you seem to be drunk. You'd better go home and sleep it off. Why don't you want to call the police? Came mockingly from behind the door. Honey, Melissa interjected in a half-whisper. Why talk to this lunatic? Let's really call the police and be done with it. Let them deal with him. We have kids after all. They're scared. Children, wheezed the intruder, obviously having heard Melissa's words. For some reason, the mention of boys cheered him up terribly. For several minutes, his nasty grinding laughter echoed from behind the door. At last he calmed down and said in a rather stern tone, That's the child that's been stolen, and you'll have to give it back. Here the situation began to clear up. James realized that there was only one person alive who could make such a claim against him, and that was probably his late ex-girlfriend's husband and Alex's stepfather. The landlord had the urge to immediately open the door and have a man-to-man talk with this man. However, he prudently did not do so. Instead, he replied, raising his voice slightly, Alex is my son. It's been proven by forensics. So I have every right to take him away and bring him up as I see fit. And why do you, an alcoholic, need him? I don't understand at all. You'd better get out of here. That's your opinion. You want him, take him, do what you want. But the little one's not yours. Let's do this the easy way. The guest persisted. We've already started the adoption process. The other one will be ours too. James mouthed, You can go to court. But I don't think anything will come of it. You're clearly not a suitable candidate to be a father. His fervent speech was interrupted by the same gnashing and laughter. I'm not going to be any kind of father, the guest whispered. I ought to be. Only the baby isn't mine, and certainly not Jenny's. She only agreed to carry it, and had to give it to some rich guy like you for a lot of money. What? James blurted out. Her mother was ill, the intruder eagerly shared, or maybe she still is, that I don't know about. But it's not likely. She was in some kind of hospital or hospice, and surgery was required. I think it's a bit late to make a fuss. I could really use the money. So give the boy back, please. Something about your story doesn't add up, James muttered thoughtfully. If it's as you say, why didn't Jenny give the baby to the customer? How the hell should I know? Maybe the hormones kicked in. She's a woman. What can you take from her? But she refused to give it back. She started hiding from the rich man and from me when I told her that she should give the child back and get the money. But apparently there were reasons. What's this rich man's name? Mr. Henderson is his name. Travis, I think. James, you mustn't deceive yourself. He's been coming to me for the kid for a while now. He even promised to pay me extra if I found it. And I did. So don't even think you can trick me and take my money for yourself. James was stunned. Mr. Travis Henderson. This was his biggest rival, the one he suspected of setting up the setup with the kids and the reporters. The businessman whose business had nearly collapsed at one point because of the law and order in the company James had entrusted to him. James had hoped, in asking the question, that he would be able to negotiate with the child's biological father, maybe pay him off or somehow come to a compromise. But something told him that in this case, this option is not available. However, nothing prevented him from trying anyway. The hapless stepfather was quiet, making it clear that if the child was not given back in a good way, he would have to resort to other methods of influence. Where did you get such clever words, you alcoholic? James thought, annoyed. Look, he said, I'm not giving you Stephen. Don't even count on it. Get out of here, or I really will call the police. All right, I'll be off now, the visitor grumbled from behind the door. Don't get excited, you'll be dealt with. And he did leave, leaving Alex to agonize over what to do now. But he was unable to think of anything to do other than talk openly to Mr. Travis. The next day, right from the morning, he called his competitor to make an appointment on a very important matter. Predictably, Mr. Travis did not respond immediately, making James nervous and apparently not yet realizing that the matter was important to him too. When the reply was finally received, it dryly informed him that Mr. Travis would have time to meet with him in 2 or 3 weeks. It was important for James not to give away in any way how important this meeting was to him, so he calmly told his rival that he was satisfied with the time frame and was willing to wait. Something told him that the unpleasant conversation would take place much sooner than the agreed time. After all, the unhappy drunkard would surely tell Mr. Travis where he could find the child he considered his own. And so it was. The very next day, the competitor called, shouting into the receiver and threatening every possible punishment, from heavenly to legal. It was difficult to keep calm in such circumstances, but still necessary. Finally, James managed to cut into Mr. Travis's monologue and informed him that he was only prepared to discuss anything in person. "Then expect me in your office within the hour," the man cut him off. The man bellowed and hung up. He arrived in less than half an hour. He did not even dignify the secretary, who tried in vain to call him to order, and literally burst into the office. Again, he began the conversation by shouting and threatening. "Mr. Travis, calm down," said the master of the office to him, himself hardly keeping a calm tone. "We are businessmen. Sit down, have some coffee. Let's have a normal conversation." "What exactly are you going to talk about?" Mr. Travis bristled. "Right now it looks like you've stolen my baby and are deliberately hiding it from me," the man continued. "Can you imagine the money I paid for him?" "You haven't paid anything yet," James thought with disgust. "And as far as I know, you're not likely to pay it. It's a waste for that alcoholic to hope." "I understand," he said aloud, "and I'm prepared to compensate you for the expenses incurred, and of course to pay extra for the inconvenience." "Do you think I haven't got enough money, or what?" hurled back Mr. Travis. "I don't need your charity. I want my baby." "Oh." James sighed heavily. "Oh. It's not charity," he retorted. "It's a bargain. I'm willing to buy this baby from you. You've never seen him once in your life anyway. Don't know anything about him. Besides, he's already grown up in a dysfunctional family with an alcoholic stepfather. Why would you do that? Wouldn't it be easier to order, so to speak, a new child, and leave this one alone?" "No easier," Mr. Travis replied vehemently. In this vein, the conversation went on for several more hours and quite expectedly produced no results. James was determined to fight for the boy to the end. His adversary was no less firm in his position, apparently not so much because of the child as to harm his hated rival. At last, Mr. Travis could not bear it. The rage, which he had already made little effort to conceal throughout the conversation, seemed to have finally darkened his mind. He jumped up from his seat, fists clenched, and gave James a fiery glare. He thought for a second that he was about to get into a rather ugly fight. However, it was avoided. "I'll see you in court," his rival muttered through gritted teeth. And indeed, soon enough James received a summons, and, in addition, the unfortunate news that the adoption proceedings had been put on hold, because new facts had come to light that might prevent it from being finalized successfully. "I'm on it," Melissa said firmly as she familiarized herself with all the documents she had received. "I'm not going to let that creep take our boys." "And what do you plan to do?" James inquired with some concern in his voice. "Like what?" "Sue, of course," she pronounced. "Or have you forgotten that I'm actually a lawyer by training?" To be honest, James had actually managed to forget that fact. At work, Melissa had long held a position far removed from law, though it had to be admitted that her knowledge of the law had certainly helped her with her job duties. "I haven't forgotten," he replied. "Still, you haven't had practice in a while. Perhaps we should hire a more experienced lawyer after all." "Don't worry, I'll definitely consult with practicing colleagues, especially since I still have some connections from my college days. But any outside lawyer, even a very experienced one, is unlikely to be able to handle this better than me." "Why is that?" Melissa looked at her spouse carefully, as if wondering how much she could tell him. Finally, making up her mind, she uttered, "Because objectively speaking, we have very little chance. Well, I mean, of course we'll defend Alex. That's not a problem. But as for Stephen, it's more complicated. I've got ideas on exactly how to do it. But any normal lawyer in my position would advise us to settle amicably to avoid more serious trouble. Well, James stretched out, in that case, I really can only trust you with this. And so they did. Melissa sat all day long poring over statutes and case law, hoping to find something to hold on to. In the end, it turned out that Stephen wasn't needed either by James' ex-girlfriend's husband or his own biological father. For months now, he had been living with their family. What's more, the adoption process was later set in motion, and only now someone has come forward claiming rights to the child. Logically, the court should have acted first of all in the interests of the baby and awarded compensation to his biological father, but leave Stephen in a family where he was truly cared for. Besides, Melissa had no reason to doubt that Alex would absolutely be left with them by the court. But primarily because he's James' own son and gets all the care he needs from him. Oh, and he'll also be able to make a statement himself that he wants to stay with his daddy. Of course, he's too young for the judge to be obliged to take his opinion into account, but he can still take it into account. And then there's not much claim to taking the older boy away. He had already become attached to his brother, whom he had been caring for several months practically alone. And this fact, in theory, the court should also take into account. After all, even when issued from orphanages, the law says not to separate brothers and sisters, determining them in the same family, and Stephen's mother was the same as Alex's. However, as it turned out, all these arguments made no impression on the court. It seemed that none of the participants in the trial ever thought of considering Stephen as a child, as a living being. He was, it seemed, a commodity which by contract was to go to Mr. Travis, and the court would not agree to any other terms. The boy was to be given to him. As for Alex, there was no difficulty with him, as Melissa had anticipated. No one had particularly claimed him for themselves, not the stepfather, and certainly not Mr. Travis. As it happened, the boy's siblings found themselves separated, and there was nothing to be done about it. With a heavy heart, the couple gave Stephen to his biological father. Both Alex and James grieved about it, but the loss hit Melissa the hardest. Maybe it was because she'd spent days on end, with little sleep, doing nothing but protecting this child from a man who inspired no confidence in her. Or maybe it was because she herself had grown attached to Stephen as if he were her own. Another casualty of the trial was, oddly enough, Alex's stepfather. As James had hoped, he never saw the money he had been promised. Mr. Travis talked to him about the huge legal fees and the fact that, in fact, he himself had to seek the return of his child. He gave him some money and told him not to show his face again, and something in his tone suggested to the man that it would be better not to argue with him. For a while, James and Melissa's family had been in a very sad mood. They couldn't even get to see Stephen once in a while, or get information about his life and condition, except with the voluntary consent of his biological father, which, of course, none of them dared to dream of. But soon the couple again smiled luck, completely unexpected, and undoubtedly mitigated the bitterness of losing Stephen. During another medical checkup, Melissa received the news that she was pregnant. "Wow," James exclaimed, hugging her. "It's like some kind of miracle." "I guess this is compensation for us," Melissa joked sadly. "One was taken away, so God decided to send another." It was in this mixed mood that they lived for several months. Gradually, though, the loss of Stephen began to feel less acute, though, of course, the couple never forgot him. Neither did Alex, but more and more their attention was occupied by another child, not yet born, but promising to appear literally from day to day. At that moment, Alex's stepfather reappeared, just like the first time he knocked on the door of their house. But this time he knocked quietly and even intelligently, and he looked even worse than before. But the persistent odor of alcohol, his constant companion, was no longer present. "I'm that," he started embarrassedly when James opened the door. "I wanted to apologize. I was wrong about the money, and it was a bit of an oversight, I guess. I was greedy, and I didn't get anything out of it anyway. That's what I should do." "Oh, come on," James said peacefully. "Why bring up the past? You can't bring it back anyway. We're not holding a grudge." "All right, then." He hesitated on the doorstep, as if he wanted to say something else but didn't dare. James knew he had a request to make, and that was why he had come to apologize so suddenly. "What's your name? What's your name?" he asked. I didn't know your name, and I didn't have time for it. "Miles, me," he said, seeming even more embarrassed. "What did you want, Miles? I see you didn't just come to apologize, so speak up." "There's no offense for asking. I've been thinking, that's it, I've given up drinking. Even went to the clinic to code me. I have a certificate, I can bring it. Anyway, I need a job, any kind of job. I used to be a security guard before I started drinking. I can be a driver too, I've got my license. Maybe there's something out there?" James looked at him thoughtfully. There were no vacancies in his firm right now, and to be honest, he was wary of bringing such an unreliable man into his business, even as a security guard. But sympathy outweighed it. He had to help, especially since Miles was already on the path of correction. It wouldn't be good to push him away at a time like this. "Tell you what," he said, "no vacancies right now, but I need a janitor to keep an eye on the lot. You can take care of that for now. As soon as something more suitable becomes available, I'll put you in a better place." "Whatever you say," Miles said. James could hear the disappointment and even irritation in his voice. He could understand it, though it probably wasn't very pleasant to work as a janitor for someone you obviously had no warm feelings for. And besides, maybe it all just seemed to him. All the more so because Miles was doing a pretty good job. He wasn't late for work, and apparently he really didn't touch the bottle anymore. Even Alex, who had been afraid to go out into the yard when his former stepfather was there, had grown bolder over time. He no longer saw anything bad from the man. Even felt sorry for him, James said once. "And that's right," he retorted, "people should be treated kindly. Anyone can make a mistake, but not everyone can understand and forgive." In the meantime, Melissa was preparing for the upcoming birth. She was reading various books and articles, going to courses for expectant mothers. The only thing was that she did not want to go to the maternity hospital for preservation. "Well, how can I leave Alex alone?" she said. "You're always at work. And I'm sorry. I don't have any confidence in that." "We could get a nanny for Alex," James insisted. "But you, in case something goes wrong." "But you'll be around," she waved it off lightly, "so we'll manage somehow." However, when the due date came, her husband wasn't around. Urgently summoned to a meeting in the capital, where the head office of the company was now located. There was no way to refuse or postpone the trip. With a heavy heart, James was leaving on a business trip, and as it turned out, his assumption began to come true. For a week now, a terrible snowstorm had been raging in the city, and all the roads were blocked. So when Melissa went into labor, the ambulance, no matter how hard it tried, couldn't get to their cottage. "Miles, help!" She turned to the janitor in a semi-fainting state. "We need to call a tractor to clear the road for the ambulance." "Everyone needs a tractor nowadays," he replied in a rather indifferent tone. "They're always busy. I can't get through. I'm afraid I can't clear this much with a shovel." Melissa got the distinct impression that Miles hadn't even tried to call. But she thought that in her current state of mind, she might not have an adequate perception of reality. She was in a very bad way. The physical pain was intensified by fear. She was afraid not so much for herself as for her future baby. After all, anything could go wrong without qualified medical help. In the end, almost fainting from the pain, by some miracle Melissa managed to call her husband and explain to him what was going on. James in turn managed to get through to the road clearing service. After about half an hour, the long-awaited ambulance was finally able to make its way to the house. The baby, who was named Alice, was born right in the car, very close to the hospital. She was perfectly healthy. The only thing that marred this joyous event was a deep cut left on her leg. Doctors in the ambulance, in a wild rush, not quite prepared for delivery in the field, made an unfortunate mistake, which resulted in this wound. However, Melissa had no complaints to the doctors. After all, they managed to save her and her baby's life in a critical situation. And the fact that on the girl's leg will remain a scar, she considered the least of the possible problems. And her husband, of course, agreed with her assessment of the situation. Now there were 4 of them. James and Melissa couldn't get enough of their newborn daughter, but they did not forget about Alex, who had managed to become their native and favorite son. despite the fact that he appeared in their lives quite late and was already at a conscious age. The boy himself also became attached to his little sister. It seemed that all the bad things were over, live and rejoice. But one night the family was hit by a new blow. James was the first to feel it. When he woke up from the unbearable smell of burning and opened his eyes, he realized that the whole room was covered with acrid smoke. He shook Melissa awake and rushed to one of the children's rooms, which was closer to their bedroom, to get out of the house. Afterwards, James berated himself many times for his actions. Perhaps he could have done more, run to the second nursery, saved both children. But at that moment, it seemed to him that if he did not jump out of the house with a child in his arms, it would be too late. He would suffocate himself and would not be able to save the children. And so it was that Melissa got out of the burning building, followed by James, holding Alex. But Alice, their little girl, who had not yet had time to see anything in the world, remained inside. Afterwards, rescuers couldn't even find her remains. The fire seems to have destroyed her fragile body without a trace. Of course, an investigation followed the incident. In the end, the police concluded that the cause of the fire was merely last year's leaves, one cigarette butt by a random passerby, and everything went up in flames. And it was as if there was no one to blame, James quoted. "How could there be?" Melissa exclaimed indignantly when James voiced the thought to her. And who, exactly, was supposed to keep an eye on that foliage? Whose responsibility was it to clean it up? I'm not surprised he was counting on a similar effect. "You're being unfair," her spouse tried to reason with her. "It's an accident, tragic, certainly. But there was no malice here. That's what even the police proved, after all." "So be it," Melissa didn't give up. "But in that case, it's criminal negligence that cost our daughter's life. Are we really going to just forget about it like that?" "And what do you suggest?" "I suggest that this Miles of yours look for work elsewhere and never bother our family again. He's caused us too much grief." James didn't agree with his wife, but he could perfectly understand why she said that. She didn't trust Miles enough. And now these two incidents, one after the other. First, the fact that he couldn't get through to the road cleaning service, and then the fire. Naturally, the grief-stricken mother saw it as a manifestation of malice. He only hoped that Miles was back on his feet enough to actually find a new job, not go back to his usual lifestyle of paying 3 salaries. He'd parted ways with the janitor for good. He didn't mind, though, as if he had nothing more to do in the house, as if their paths had invisibly parted before he was officially dismissed. At Melissa's insistence, they didn't rebuild the cottage. It would be too hard for her to go back to the same place. Instead, they bought a new house and began to live quietly and peacefully, the 3 of them. Melissa wasn't the only one grieving, of course. James was also grieving, and even more so Alex. Not only had he grown to love his little sister like his own, but he blamed himself for her death. If his father had pulled Alice out instead of him, she'd be alive now, and everyone would be better off. Only a few years of seeing a therapist could rid him of this thought. But time passed, and all the tragedies and hardships gradually faded into the past. Of course, they were not completely erased from his memory, but they became less painful. You still had to live, no matter what. Melissa, James, and Alex had each other to help them through all the hardships. Alex grew up a kind and modest boy, just like his father. Even as a teenager, Alex always stood up for those who were offended, even if the offenders were older and stronger than him. He simply could not stand injustice. He studied very well and was the pride of his parents in everything. In honor of the brilliant completion of the next school year, he was given a bicycle. Now, as soon as the weather permitted, the boy would get on his iron horse and set out to explore the city. It was his favorite pastime. And one day, during such a trip, Alex's attention was attracted by an extremely unpleasant picture. A girl, a few years younger than him, was sitting on some old, drab blanket. Her clothes were dirty. She looked like a homeless person trying to get a piece of bread. Next to her stood a boy about the same age as she was. It was obvious, however, that the boy belonged to a completely different stratum of society. The clean, new, perfectly ironed suit looked even a little ridiculous on a kid of 8 or 9 years old. But the boy wore it with incredible importance. He was saying something to the girl sitting in front of him, and as Alex noticed, tears were glistening in her eyes, and her whole look was hunted. Something told the teenager that this was not the first time something like this had happened. As he got closer, he could hear the boy's words addressed to his unhappy interlocutor. "What? Are you here again? What did I tell you last time? Stay out of my sight." "I didn't mean to," the girl whispered. "Right?" He moved closer to her. "And what did I tell you would happen if I saw you again?" The girl didn't answer anything, only squirmed even more, and the boy came even closer to her. Deliberately slowly raised his hand, and then began to sharply lower it down towards the defenseless child's head. At that time, Alex was just in time to jump off his bike and intercept the blow. "Who the hell are you?" The kid was indignant. Despite the age difference, Alex felt as if this cocky type was looking down at him. "Didn't your parents teach you that it's wrong to hurt the weak?" he replied. "I ask you, who are you to touch me? Do you even know who my father is? You're going to be in big trouble," the boy wailed. "Well, who was your father?" Alex asked with undisguised irony. "Let it be known to you," the man said importantly. "My father is the man in charge of this town, Mr. Travis Henderson. Does that mean anything to you?" Alex recoiled from the boy in horror, releasing his hand from his dead grip. With round eyes, he stared at the bully and couldn't believe what he had just heard. "What scared?" stretched out the boy contentedly. "Then you know. I'm not Stephen here for you, I'm Stephen Henderson." He said something else long, tedious, arrogant, but Alex wasn't listening to him anymore. The first shock of the accidental meeting with his brother had passed, and he remembered why he had stopped. All his attention was now directed to the girl. He helped her up and offered her a ride on his bike. She accepted the offer gladly. Alex suspected that it was not about the bike at all. She just wanted to be as far away from Stephen as possible. Besides, she felt safer around the older man, who was clearly favorable to her. Unable to think of anything better to do, Alex took his new acquaintance to his house. His parents, after all, had some experience in helping such unhappy, abandoned children. "So, who's your new friend?" his father asked good-naturedly, as if not noticing the state of his guest's clothes. "Well, to be honest, I don't know." Alex admitted she's been abused by. He blanched. Should he tell his father? Should he upset him? In the end, decided he probably shouldn't. "One nasty little boy. She was all alone on the street, and I thought she needed help. My son," James stated proudly. "Well, come on in, young lady. Let's see what we can do to help." It was decided that the first order of business would be to get the girl washed, changed, and fed. Melissa went to the bathroom in case the little girl needed help. It wasn't long before Alex and James heard a scream from the direction they had gone. Both of them got excited, jumped up, and ran to help. Already standing at the bathroom door, they suddenly realized that it was more of a surprised and even joyful scream. None of them realized what to do. And at that moment, Melissa appeared from the room, her eyes tearful, but a wide smile on her face. In her arms, she was holding a little girl, who was no longer wearing her tights, which were dirty and torn in several places. And that's when both Alex and James realized everything. She had a small, oddly shaped scar on her legs just above the knee. It couldn't have been a coincidence. The whole family had witnessed a real miracle. Alice, their daughter and sister, was alive and moreover had come home. That would have been the end of the story, but James was still wondering how it was possible. Someone had pulled the child out of the fire, but instead of giving her to her grief-stricken parents, they had taken her to an unknown destination. But who could have done it? And more importantly, why? James had only one clue, just one thought of someone who could help him get answers to these questions. Finding the person proved difficult, but numerous connections, both formal and not so formal, did the trick. One fine Sunday afternoon, James headed to the very outskirts of town, where there was a hospice for the poor. "James," wondered one of the patients as he approached his bedside, "have you got any of the—" "No, Miles," replied the visitor sternly. "I've come to see you." For a moment there was a flicker of surprise in the former janitor's eyes, but then it was replaced by understanding. "Has your daughter been found?" he asked. "She has," James sighed, "and I'd like to know exactly how she went missing, what happened that day, And most importantly, what did you have to arrange this for? The old man stared at him for a long moment, not knowing where to start. He didn't look frightened, rather somehow confused. Finally, after a few moments of tense silence, he spoke. "I'm afraid you don't fully realize the meanness of what I've done," he began. "Believe it or not, it's been eating away at me for years. I even wanted to find you and tell you, but you'd moved away and I had no idea what to do in such cases. How could I find you? And then I got sick and ended up right here. How does life happen? My wife's mother died here. And it turns out it was my fault too. Now I'm on my own. Well, that's not what you're interested in, is it? I must confess, at least before I die, that not only did I steal your daughter, but I set fire to your house. I was so angry at you. I thought you'd ruined my life. I thought it was because of you that I had lost the big money Mr. Travis had promised me for the child. Of course, I came to you looking for work, hoping I could get revenge. And then I got a new blow, saying you'll be my janitor, and that's all you're good for. And all this anger, resentment, hatred just kept piling up. And then every day I saw how well you live. A house, a business, a strong family, and a beautiful wife. And I have nothing. Now I realize how ridiculous that sounds. But back then I was just blinded by this terrible hatred. So I decided to take revenge. First, I did not call a tractor to clear the road. Of course, I didn't think then that a child could die from it. I just wanted to do some harm. And I managed it, but my thirst for revenge was never satisfied. I set fire to these leaves, then we wrote it all off as flu. Then I threw the cigarette butt. Honestly, why should I lie now? I didn't think it would go up in flames and spread to the house. I thought the house would go quietly, cause a little trouble. When I saw what happened, I was scared myself. Then I looked. Your wife had jumped out, you and your son, but your daughter was gone. I climbed through the window into her bedroom and pulled her out. I wanted to stop, but I got angry again. So I decided not to give you the baby. I took the house and left it on the doorstep. I don't know what happened next, if it didn't work out. But she's all right now, James replied. Thank you, of course, Miles, for your honesty. And I guess I forgive you. He left the hospice with mixed feelings. He refused the offer to move him to a better hospital, saying he'd got what he deserved. And that sadness never left James. He really didn't hold a grudge against the old janitor. On the other hand, now he knew exactly what had happened, but he wasn't sure he needed to know. When James got to the house, Melissa was just setting the table. Alex and Alice were playing on the floor of the living room, playing something apparently very exciting for both of them. Suddenly, all his worries and doubts were gone. He was home, and all the people closest to him were with him. All the bad things were left in the distant past, and now only the future, bright and beautiful, awaited them all. Why are you rushing around, John? You've had enough of going back and forth. Emily Parker grumbled, looking at her husband. She loves Michael, and they will marry. Get over it. I cannot, John Parker flared up, emotionally splashing his hands. I cannot see my daughter marry this mediocre. Couldn't she find someone of her own caliber? Or would you rather not get divorced at all? All you think about is yourself. You were a big mouth on Alex, and I'll give you that. But Michael is better suited for Sarah. He's a hard worker. He respects her, he takes care of her, and most importantly, she glows around him. That's what you should be thinking about, not your comfort. So it's not for you to live with him till old age, and not for you to have children. You made your family the way you wanted it. Don't stop Sarah from doing the same. Emily put her laptop aside where she was studying a new needlework scheme, and turned her full attention to her spouse. To remember, was Sarah and Ethan happy? And what had gotten them divorced? That's right. But is that the kind of husband you want for your daughter? All right, calm down or your blood pressure will rise. John waved her off. I'm just grumbling. What's going to change? If she wants to live the rest of her life with that fool, that's up to her. But I'm not helping. Emily lowered her voice as the voices and laughter of the soon-to-be newlyweds could be heard behind the wall. Sarah and Michael were getting married. In just 2 weeks, the preparations were in full swing, and the father of the bride could not accept it. Ethan was from a decent family of businessmen, so the father-in-law immediately liked. They could spend hours discussing financial schemes, negotiation strategies, and ideas that no one would realize for another 5 generations. Michael and John's opinion was no use at all. He wasn't a beggar. He had an average income, but he lived modestly, having a huge load of responsibility on his shoulders. Do you want him? He will only bring everything to that family. John bent his line from the very beginning of the relationship, setting his daughter against the prospective groom. Michael is a great family man, and his care for his mom and disabled brother speaks to that. How many young men have you met who pull the whole family together? Sarah stood up for her lover. As much as you don't like it, Dad Mike is going to be part of our family. I'm not doing it. Sarah wasn't intimidated by Michael's ailing relatives. His mother Nancy was suffering from stomach ulcers, and his brother Zach had been confined to a wheelchair since childhood and needed constant care. But John wasn't about to accept their family's impending disaster. He was determined to upset the wedding by all means, but he didn't know how to break up Sarah and Michael. The right idea came at the last moment. John decided to invite Ethan to his daughter's second wedding. Let the offended ex-husband himself solve all the problems for him. Having received an invitation to the celebration of the newlyweds on behalf of Sarah herself, Ethan had to appear at the registry office right before the signing to prevent Sarah and Michael to put signatures on the documents. Everything happened almost exactly as John Parker had envisioned. Only Michael turned out to be much more bold and firm than he expected. "Oh my God, Nancy," the maid of honor exhaled when she saw Ethan among the guests. He appeared with a face twisted with rage and immediately lunged at Sarah. "You wretch," he shouted, lunging forward. But Michael immediately grabbed his arm. "Let me go, you scoundrel." A distinct odor of alcohol emanated from the intruder. "How dare you humiliate me like this? Inviting me to your wedding. Damn your wedding to hell. You dumped me for that pauper." "Shut up. Shut up. Now, there are guards here," Sarah shouted, wanting to protect her fiancé. She was sick of everyone around her belittling Michael. After all, she loved him. She loved and knew how gentle, reliable, smart, and funny he was. "Why are you all meddling in my life?" she shouted. "Get him out." Michael covered his fiancée with himself. The drunk Ethan wanted to slap her on the cheek, but hit her on the sturdy man's back. "Well, hold on," Michael muttered through gritted teeth. "How dare you?" He pounced on Ethan and flung him to the floor. Michael didn't worry about the wedding suit anymore. The opponents rolled around on the floor. A few hard punches to Ethan's face helped Michael release his anger and feel victorious. Afterward, he was dragged off the defeated man, who was spitting blood onto the white tile. Ethan sat with an expression of utter madness on his broken face. He certainly didn't feel guilty about what had happened. "If you go near Sarah again, you'll regret it," Michael told him. Sarah tried to get her fiancé's attention, but he was too excited to remember about the guests and the party. And inside, everything was raging with injustice and thirst to protect her beloved. How dare Ethan show up at their party and humiliate Sarah in front of everyone? "You're going to regret this." Ethan struggled to his feet. "Both of you will. Couple of lovebirds. You're right for each other. But don't give a damn about him. He's in the past." Sarah wrapped her arms around Michael's face and tried to catch his gaze. "I'm here, I'm with you. Please, just calm down. We have to go to the signing soon and you're covered in bruises." "Yeah, okay. I'm cooled down." Someone handed Sarah a damp napkin and she gently wiped her fiancé's face. A bottle of water was held out from the other side so Michael could catch his breath. "It's okay. He's gone," Sarah continued in an already calmer tone. "Are you ready to walk through that door and change everything?" "And of course I am," Michael managed to smile and kissed his fiancée to the hooting of everyone. "Hey, it's still early," shouted someone in the crowd, which diffused the situation. After they put wedding rings on each other's fingers and solemnly signed the marriage registration document, all worries dissolved. And now they became spouses, made a new step in their relationship. But despite the birth of a new family, witnesses of the fight between Ethan and Michael left the impression that now these two had become irreconcilable enemies. And in the heart of Sarah crept a suspicion that it was set up by her father. The young people were not ignored. Everyone wanted to dance with the culprits of the celebration, to send their congratulations, to receive a sincere smile in return. To the holiday itself, it was impossible to pick on, even with great desire. Sarah worked for months on the sketch of her own dress, the decor of the hall, the selection of musicians and playlist. She'd worked with Emily Parker and Nancy on the menu. But something still made her husband sad. "Zach and Mom aren't coming," he said over the phone a week before the wedding. Why? She wondered, immediately hugging Michael. Sarah knew how hard it was for him to take care of his family, and understood that he was upset. "I understand Zach doesn't like gatherings. He's uncomfortable in a wheelchair, and the attention from people scares him. But Nancy could stop by for an hour." "You say it," Michael replied irritably, but immediately calmed down. I'm sorry I'm edgy about this. I've done so much for them. They can't even be happy for me to attend our wedding. I know they're not used to that, and your family doesn't like us. But we can be patient. Besides, I'll also have to be gone for an hour to help my mom put Zach on a new medication through an IV. She scared herself. Sarah sighed heavily. She was used to Michael's family treating him like a slave, not realizing that he deserved personal happiness. It wasn't his fault. He wasn't sick of anything. But sometimes it was as if his family blamed him for it and took advantage of his kindness. "Let's hire a nurse for the day. It may be expensive, but the wedding is worth it. We can afford it once. Zach will be looked after, and you can dance with your mom at our wedding." But Nancy didn't dare leave her son in the care of a stranger. So Michael had to leave his own wedding after all to fulfill her whims. That's when Sarah and John Parker's dance took place. "Thank you, Daddy, for the memorable gift," Sarah said wryly as her father put his arm around her and spun her in a slow waltz. "I won't even deny it," he replied with a completely serene look. "Your plan failed. Michael is now my lawfully wedded husband. Get over it already. And if you don't play fair, I'll answer to you too. Are you really threatening your father?" John didn't take his daughter's threats seriously. "This can't go on any longer. Either you accept our union or we will move to another town away from your intrigues. That's the way it's going to be." Daddy, meaning the determined attitude, her daughter made John Parker look her in the eye with surprise. So there was a loud knock on the door of the newlyweds' apartment. Sarah woke to a knock on the door. It was only 9 in the morning. Who could have come this early? She tied the belt of her robe and went to open the door. A man in a police uniform stood on the doorstep. She was wide awake. An uneasiness stirred inside. "Hello, is something wrong?" she asked. "Good afternoon. Does Michael Smith reside here?" the policeman inquired. "Yes, he's still asleep." "Why?" Alarmed, Sarah let the persistent policeman inside. "Your husband is coming with us. He's charged with murder." "Are you out of your mind? What murder?" Sarah laughed nervously. "We had a wedding yesterday. Oh, and we spent the night together. Ethan Thompson was murdered last night." "Ethan? No way." "It can't be. I mean, Michael wasn't at the wedding all the time. He was away all the time." "Yes, but he was traveling home. He had to give his brother his medicine. All the guests remember the fight with your ex-husband well, Sarah. Now, get out of the way of the work." No amount of protest from Sarah helped to counter the detention. Michael was lifted from the bed, allowed to dress, and immediately taken to the station. "I'm going to follow you, Michael. I'm going to sort this out. This is a terrible mistake. I'll get you a lawyer. You won't be held for long. Do you hear me?" "This is some kind of setup," repeated the confused Michael, who had less time to recover than his wife. Before he could wake up, he was already an accused murderer. Sarah gave detailed testimony about yesterday and Michael's relationship with the late Ethan. She still couldn't believe that it was necessary to talk about her ex-husband as if he were deceased. It was all too much for her. The lavish celebration had been overshadowed by the death and its aftermath. But what bothered Sarah more was that her Michael was now in a detention center with some scumbags that could seriously hurt him. "What's up, kid? You got someone down?" A large inmate asked Michael. The man chose the tactic of silence, hoping not to provoke a conflict. But that only irritated his cellmates. "Have you swallowed your tongue? Or do you think you're better than us? You think a rich wife will get you out soon? Good, you pretty girl. I wouldn't mind a vacation with one, either." Michael was on edge. Ethan's antics had gotten to him yesterday, and today some guy had brought it up again. The fight had come out of the blue. Both of them had been hit hard. The other detainees began to encourage their rivals to fight harder, until the police officers separated them. Only later Michael realized that he was wrong to fight. His temper could be attributed to the constant aggression in his character, and that would be an indicator that he was capable of murder. "Dad, you have to get Michael out of there. He's already been beaten up," Sarah began without greeting, showing up at her parents' house. "I've heard about your sweetheart's exploits. You're wrong to think I'm going to help. Now his true nature has been revealed. He's a murderer, daughter. A murderer," John Parker pressed, seeing that Sarah was ready to cry. "Believe me, Michael didn't do this. He's not like that. You're only glad he did, but he's not allowed to be there." "Dad, how can't you understand? He'll be ruined, maimed, or even killed. Let them work it out for themselves. You stood up for your husband, didn't you? Keep standing up for him." "I won't get my hands dirty in crime." John remained adamant and left the room. While Sarah cried, afraid of the unknown future. Only yesterday she had been a happy bride, and today she was the wife of a murderer. How would she deal with this alone? All day long she darted back and forth to get her husband out of the detention center as soon as possible. After her father refused to help her, she realized she could only rely on herself. "I want to see my husband," Sarah told the duty officer at the police station. "His lawyer is about to arrive, and soon you won't be able to keep him here for anything." "Citizen, calm down. No one is intentionally abusing your husband. It's just the way it is." "What did you say his last name was?" After a few nervous minutes of waiting, Sarah was escorted into the office by Alex Parker, the investigator on Alex's murder case. Michael was brought in. Sarah jumped up from her chair and held out her hands to her husband. "No touching," barked a policeman from behind the door who was watching the couple's rendezvous through the bars. "Jesus, what have they done to you?" Tears were running down Sarah's cheeks. It pained her to look at a battered Michael, who couldn't even smile at the joy of seeing her. "It'll heal," Michael brushed it off, trying to look braver than he actually felt. But the longer he stayed in the isolation cell, the more hopeless his own plight seemed. Someone had made it so convenient that his fight and his excursion from the restaurant had coincided with the day Ethan had died. Apparently that person was aware of their family drama and had twisted it to make the situation work for him. "What do you know? Is your father going to help? He seems to have all the connections." Sarah immediately gloomed. "Dad's just glad you're here. I arranged it all myself. And there's a lawyer on his way to see you. He's one of the best in town. Tell him everything. Don't hold anything back. You can trust him." "What did the investigator tell you? Didn't he show you the pictures? Explain how he was killed?" "He was walking drunk on the embankment. Someone hit him on the head from behind, and that was enough for Ethan to pass away." Michael exhaled. "You know, we need to find witnesses, my neighbors at the house, to testify. I can't have been in two places at once. It's not a big city, but you can't go to both places in an hour and a half. Who could have seen you in the yard yesterday? Which of your neighbors did you see?" "If I could ask around, get their statements on camera with their permission," Sarah suggested, excited that she could do something to help her husband. "After you talk to the lawyer, he'll already have one piece of evidence on his hands in time. That's what he'll build off of." "Good. And go to the waterfront," Michael suggested, catching a glimmer of hope. "It's a crowded place. There's always someone walking around. Maybe someone had seen Ethan and could recognize him. There are stores and parking lots nearby. There should be cameras in them." "Are you right?" Sarah's thinking. "But whoever committed the murder and set you up so cleverly wouldn't show up in front of the cameras. But I'll check it out anyway. Hang in there. It'll all be over soon." "Oh my God, I want to hold you so badly." Michael sang the whole thing, but he had to let his wife go with just a look. And Sarah had to go tricky to get the sect footage from the stores nearest the waterfront. "My fiancé was hit on the head and robbed yesterday," she said, dropping tears. "And we have a wedding in a week. Help me find the scoundrels. I beg you very much." But everywhere she got the same answer. "Excuse me, girl, but we have cameras to keep the local vagrants away. In summertime, the stalls are outside, so they carry everything they can carry. And these things scare them off." "Vagrants? Are they in this place all the time?" Sarah asked hopefully, finding a new clue to the horrible crime. "Yeah, always hanging around, begging for alms from kind-hearted passers-by. I think they should be chased out of here with a stick, scaring away all the decent customers with their stench. "Thank you very much," Sarah replied to the shopkeeper and sprinted out into the street. It didn't take long to find them. A group of 4 men in old clothes were squatting shoulder to shoulder. It was getting colder outside, and they were trying to warm themselves with each other's warmth. "Hello," Sarah began cautiously. It was her first time interacting with homeless people, so she was a little apprehensive. "My name is Sarah. I need your help. There was a crime here on the waterfront last night. A man was killed and my husband is being blamed. Have any of you seen him?" She pulled her phone out of her purse and opened Ethan's photo. "Any change will help me. I'll pay it. No offense." But no one spoke to her. The vagrants glanced among themselves as they continued to study the decently dressed girl with shiny things in her ears and around her neck. These people were not used to trusting strangers. What if it was the police? Vagrants never got along with law enforcement, so they were waiting for a trick. "I'm not here with malicious intent," Sarah added, as if reading their minds. "Don't be afraid of me. I am in a desperate situation. Please consider whether you noticed anything unusual yesterday." Suddenly, one of the homeless men stood up. He appeared to be a man in his early 40s. The exact age was hard to guess. I saw him wandering around for a long time, like he was waiting for someone. Then he went around the corner. There were screams coming from there. "Female." "Are you sure?" Sarah wondered. The police hadn't said anything about a woman. Shouldn't they have known more? "I'm sure," the homeless man said firmly. She ran out of the alley afterward. Young, blonde, kept turning back. Maybe she was afraid they'd run after her. So why didn't the police say anything about her? Sarah wondered aloud, since they have another suspect. Why was Michael the only one in custody? I don't know that. But one thing I remembered was that she had something on her cheek, a scar, maybe a burn or some kind of wound, Lev recalled. And then consciousness struck Sarah in the head. It was Emma, the maid at her father's house. She had told herself that her sister's house had burned down when she was a child, a memento of that terrible day. Emma knew Ethan, for they had been married for 3 years. Ethan had crossed paths with her at her father-in-law's house. Sarah's efforts have given the police a new suspect. "Alexei Parker, can you hear me?" She followed the investigator down the hallway. "I have another suspect in Ethan's murder. Actually, a suspect." And who is that?" Smirked at him, but stopped so that the clatter of the rich lady's heels would not annoy her. "The whole department. I'm not in the mood for jokes right now. The statement's on video, and I know the suspect. Her name is Emma Gordon. She works as a maid at my father's house. That's all I know, but I hope it helps." "Help who, Sarah Parker?" "Your husband?" Alexei did not lose his skepticism, believing that the case is transparent. Ethan's killer is Michael. She'll help bring justice. And Michael too. So do you want the videotape of the deposition? Or would you prefer to see it in the courtroom? Alexei Parker stopped stalling and accepted the help. To his surprise, he realized he was wrong. There was a second suspect. The police were now looking at Emma as well, calling her in for questioning. As a witness for now. No charges had been brought against her yet. Emma was only required to talk about her relationship with Ethan. "What is your relationship with Ethan Parker?" Alexei Parker asked the question. He deliberately did not tell Emma that they knew about the murder. "So we had an affair," the woman confessed, ashamed of her connection with a married man. "How long did it last?" Quite a while. We didn't become lovers right away. For me, relations with a married man have always been forbidden. But Ethan knew how to charm. I often saw them together with Sarah Parker, and I felt bad that I agreed to sleep with her husband behind her back. But I fell in love with him. He said he and his wife were different, that we were better suited for each other. Ethan promised we'd be together after their divorce, which was the talk of the house. And that's when I dared to tell him I was expecting his child. And Emma squeezed her eyes shut, trying to stop the tears. He was just feeding me promises and would never marry an ordinary maid. He was a rich man. His reputation was important to him, as if cheating on his wife would honor him. But I found out about that later. And Ethan forced me to have an abortion, said the baby came at the wrong time, that he needed to deal with Sarah Parker first. They had a tense relationship. And when I did agree, he left me right after the procedure. Emma sobbed. He wanted to get rid of our baby from the start, so I wouldn't attach him to me. And now I can't have children because of that cowardly bastard. I can never get pregnant, never be a mother. That's why I've been stalking Ethan. I wanted to tell him everything, and he was avoiding me. I wanted him to take responsibility, to pay for what he did. You can't do that to people. You can't use them up and throw them away like toys. And so what happened between you two yesterday? What was the matter? Did Ethan do something? Emma asked, puzzled, having recovered a little from her personal drama, for she didn't know about the murder. Answer, Emma. We're looking into the circumstances of the attack on Ethan, Alexei Parker said politely, but bluntly. Emma began to guess what this was about. We agreed to meet yesterday at the waterfront. More precisely, he suddenly called me himself. You can check the calls, she added hastily, starting to get worried. Alexei realized he had startled her, but still waited for a detailed answer. He prepared to catch her in a lie. You met, and how did Ethan behave? He was drunk, started yelling at me. Emma was immersed in the events of last night when she was startled to see her resentful ex-lover in front of her. Showed up. I knew I'd come running like a dog at your first call. Without controlling the volume of his voice, Ethan immediately began insulting Emma. I'm a doggy. Then what's to say about you when Sarah got married and her family kicked you out of their lives? Everything boomeranged back to you. You're miserable. Emma didn't shy away from the pain, deceit, and betrayal she'd been through either. Emma had seen what Ethan really was. He wasn't worth her love and sympathy. It's all the same. Both you and she need a good girl to know her place. She can't be given power at all. Besides, what would she be without her father? And you without me, Ethan parried. Without you, I'd be a happy woman, a mother, and all you do is ruin people's lives. Sarah is better off without you. Her new husband isn't chasing every skirt. He doesn't need John Parker's money or a big name. Even without the money and the name, he's 100 times better than you. You're a worm who can only take advantage of someone else. On your own, you're a zero without a stick. Shut your mouth, you fool. An exasperated Ethan lunged at Emma and pinned her against the wall. She squealed as she felt the first blow to her side. Help! Help! She screamed, trying to break free from Ethan's devastating embrace. She tried to bite him through the fabric of his jacket, but she couldn't do any damage. Emma didn't realize when they were on the ground. Ethan started to choke her, but she was able to crawl away from him and push him off with her legs. Blood pounded in her head. Emma was driven by only one thought: to save herself. She grabbed the first thing she could get her hands on and kicked Ethan, who was on all fours, in the head. He immediately collapsed to the ground and groaned. Oh my God. Emma dropped the rock from her hand, staring in horror at the red stain on the back of Ethan's head. As she ran out of the alley, she caught sight of a man apparently running toward her, scream. But she wanted nothing more than to be away from this place and forget what had happened like a terrible dream. He was still moaning when I ran away. Emma looked straight into Alexa Parker's eyes. It was self-defense. Whatever he told you, I'm the victim. I have bruises on my body. Emma pulled back the collar of her blouse, exposing her neck. There, his hand marks. Emma Johnson, you're under arrest for the murder of Ethan Parker. Alexei rose from his seat. The second police officer entered the interrogation room and pulled out handcuffs. How murder? He died because of me. A look of horror and disbelief froze on Emma's face. He was breathing. I'm sure of it. I couldn't have killed him. Sarah spent most of the evening at the police station, guarding Alexei to tell her how Emma's interrogation had gone. You do realize I don't work for you, he said, noticing the woman. I can make you happy. We have a second suspect. She confessed? Sarah asked anxiously, rubbing the handle of her bag. So they're letting Michael go home? Not tonight. He'll still spend this night in lockup. We need to check Johnson's word, interview witnesses. She said she saw someone near the murder scene. After hearing about Emma's personal tragedy, Sarah realized Ethan had played himself to his own death. They divorced, after all, because their families began to denounce rumors, as if the son-in-law John Parker more than once noticed in the company of other women at various events. Ethan did not even deny it when Sarah gave him an interrogation with bias. He's a creep though, daughter, but he's good at business. A man like that should be kept to himself. Who am I going to leave the firm to after me? You're not exactly eager to run the family business, John was saying. Are you saying I should turn a blind eye to his goings-on and live with the shame? I'm your daughter, after all. Why aren't you on my side? But for a man to get carried away sometimes is a common thing. Nature. What can I do? John answered, averting his gaze. It's meanness, betrayal. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life living next to a mean, lying, insatiable animal who doesn't respect me. Sarah wanted to stay on top of the investigation. She breathed a sigh of relief that as soon as tomorrow Michael could be cleared of all charges. But she was also worried about the fate of Emma, who had also been duped by Alex. The next morning, Sarah reappeared at the police station, insisting on seeing Emma. Sarah Parker, Emma exclaimed upon seeing her erstwhile rival. I'm not here to scandalize, I'm here to help. Sarah sat down across from her. I'll get you out of here. Already called the lawyer. Tom Green is a good one. He's going to push for a state of mind. You were defending yourself, weren't you? And finding people to corroborate Ethan's alcohol-fueled rampage won't be hard, I think. Thank you so much. I couldn't have hoped for your help. I'm so sorry to you, Emma apologized sincerely. It's in the past. It doesn't matter to me anymore. All that matters is that Michael is free. But why are you doing all this for me? Because you don't deserve to go to jail for killing that bastard, Sarah smiled. In the hallway, Anna ran into Lewis, the same homeless man who had told her about Emma at the murder scene. You were brave enough to testify after all. You were afraid of the police, weren't you? Yes. I thought about it and became a witness for the defense. He nodded, adjusting his worn jacket. You're doing a good job. I know, because I was in that woman's shoes once myself. I didn't have someone like that on my side. Now I got nothing to lose. Lewis had several reasons for helping to free Emma. He had a crush on her, so they had met under strange circumstances. He, a homeless man wandering the city. She, an alley woman with blood on her hands. But Lewis wasn't deterred by this moment. He dared to cooperate with the police to be sure, for once, that justice would be served. As soon as she heard from Michael's lawyer that he was being released from the detention center, all thoughts in her head disappeared. She saw her battered, exhausted, but happy husband. Sarah ran to him, hanging on his neck. Hush, hush, my love, Michael gasped, as his wife's touch made his whole body ache. I'm not a Terminator. I missed you so much, Sarah cried, feeling a great relief in her chest. She had only been away from her husband for 2 days. What had it cost her? The frantic anxiety had not left her for a moment, but it's all behind her now. When you have no more ex-husbands, I can't take another one like that, Michael grinned. Sarah gave him a disapproving look. I don't want to think about that nightmare anymore. Come on, you need to go to the hospital. I think that wound above your eyebrow needs stitching. Why can't you control yourself even behind bars? Michael listened to his wife's grumbling with a smile. Leaving the police building with a light heart, he decided that he would never even drive on that street again. Emily Parker and John Parker were already waiting for the children at home at the set table. Michael, my boy, what have they done to you? She sighed beside her son-in-law. Our poor baby. Sit quickly at the table. Eat a lot. You must have starved there. It's no big deal. The main thing is that you got out. Michael smiled at his mother-in-law's greeting. Thank you for taking care of my family. Welcome back. John only shook Michael's hand without sentimentality. His son-in-law's return didn't please him much. He had hoped that Sarah would finally realize that such a vulnerable man like Michael, she is not a match without someone else's name, and money is not capable of anything. But his expectations remained dreams. I hope you remember what I told you at the wedding, Dad. Sarah stepped up close to her father so no one else could hear them. You take up your old ways, you won't see me or your grandchildren. I managed without you. I can keep it that way. I hear you, daughter. You don't need to threaten an old man father. John placed his palm over his heart. To which Sarah only hummed. She didn't want to find out more about her relationship with him. She was more concerned with the well-being of her husband and their family life. While Sarah was enjoying her lover's attention, Emma's fate was being decided. As a result of his work, Tom Green presented Lewis's testimony at the preliminary hearing, along with a medical report on Emma's beatings and testimony from people in Ethan's circle. The verdict came quickly. Emma did not act with the cold-blooded purpose of killing her former lover, but was merely defending herself against an attack. Your Honor, my client, a frail, frightened woman, would not have been able to stand up to a large man in an even fight. During our investigation, we learned that Ethan became violent when he drank. My client had no chance of surviving if their fight in the alley had continued, the attorney said. I agree with you, the judge nodded. I think there is no point in taking the case any further. Emma's actions are found to be self-defense. Emma was immediately released and allowed to return home. For a while longer, the residents of the house and John and Emily's servants couldn't get used to the idea that a man capable of murder worked alongside them. What a way to scare the poor woman. Oh, Emily, you wouldn't believe how much power little Emma has in her hands, one of the maids said. Indeed she does, Michael nodded, sitting in the living room with his wife's family. It's hard to imagine how she could have delivered the fatal blow. People often lose their memory, their sight from such injuries, but to do it all at once, one in death. Sarah thought her mother's words made sense. Emma herself had drawn the police's attention to the fact that Ethan was still alive when she was there. And if he was conscious, why hadn't he called an ambulance? He never forgot his cell phone. It was odd that he just stayed in the alley bleeding instead of screaming, trying to save himself, crawling out into a public place. Stop talking about that, Emma. It's just gossip, his father said. Sick of hearing about Ethan's death from every corner every day. Can we just stop talking about it for a couple hours? I come home to rest, not to listen to crime news. You're right, darling. Emily splayed her hands. If you talk about something like this for too long, negativity will build up in the room. We're already feeling some tension. Let's better watch something, youngsters. Cue the comedy. Left alone with her husband, Sarah asked Michael, don't you think Dad is getting annoyed talking about Emma, not because he's sick of them, but for some other reason? Why doesn't it bother him that a terrible thing has happened in our family circle? I've been thinking about that too. Your father usually likes to discuss the assassination attempt on a businessman as if it's entertainment. I mean, he's a big businessman himself. That's what I thought was weird. He lost it today. Maybe he knows more. After all, Emma worked for us. She was family. Her parents often referred to her as a daughter. How did this situation happen? Dad never said a word about her. So we have to find out. But do we have to? Michael squinted, looking into the face of his wife, who was at it again, if it concerns our family. The next morning, after waiting for her father to leave for the office, Sarah snuck into his office. Michael stayed in the bedroom so as not to attract the attention of the servants and Emily Parker. Sarah immediately noticed the papers on her father's desk. They were receipts of debt, which showed that Ethan owed his former father-in-law several tens of millions of rubles. Quickly taking a picture of them, Sarah turned back to her husband. Ethan owes Daddy big time, she said as she closed the door behind her. I wonder why he never mentioned it once. That's what I mean. Michael sat down on the bed and fell silent. Sarah realized he was upset and plunged into thought. You don't think your dad could have anything to do with this, do you? My dad won't give an extra penny to anyone, not even his nephews. Demands money almost as soon as it's borrowed, Sarah said, looking in front of her with glassy eyes. That's already a serious motive. Ethan's gone rancid. When we divorced, Dad stopped supporting him. He wasn't part of the family anymore. He used to play in underground casinos. He was good at it, but he used to lose. Probably borrowed money from his dad for a big bet. Wanted to use the winnings to make things right. Ethan did that a few times in our marriage, too. Michael didn't know what to say. Sarah seemed to suspect his own father. One had to be very careful with such accusations. You need to talk to him without accusations. Bring the conversation to that point, Michael suggested, putting his arm around her shoulders. I'm sorry this has come upon you. I hope John Parker had nothing to do with it. Sarah remained silent. She was pleased that Michael was supporting her at a time when her father might have turned out to be Ethan's real killer. That same evening, John found his daughter in his office. Do you have a business conversation with me? He asked, laying out some folders from a leather briefcase. Ethan owed you money. I saw the receipts. So what of it? Dad asked calmly, continuing to go about his business. I'm scared to think about it, but I'll ask nonetheless. Did you kill him? What do you think that sum was worth, to resort to such drastic solutions? What's in it for me with his death? No money from the corpse. Sarah realized her father was right, but his behavior in the last few days still seemed very suspicious. He avoided any conversation about Ethan, as if he felt guilty. and he'd been warmer with Michael, even though he rarely spoke to him. I didn't kill Ethan personally, but I did go to debt collectors who collected on his debt. I guess they didn't go too far in getting the money. Sarah put her palm to her mouth and exclaimed, "So it's because of you. When I came to ask for your help in freeing Michael, you knew all about it and you kept quiet. Deliberately turned me down. I merely seized the opportunity, as I always have. That's the quality of any businessman. Do you think you'd be living like a princess if it weren't for that ability of mine?" Raised his father's tone, beginning to get angry. "I was the one who suggested Michael to the police as a suspect. I thought it would alienate you. Dad, are you out of your mind? You play with lives, but you're not the Lord God. Because of you, a man died and 2 almost ended up behind bars. All because things aren't done the way you want them done." It all came together in Sarah's mind. Emma had hit Ethan with a rock, but not killed him. The collectors had found him in that state and miscalculated the force. But Lewis had only seen Emma and thought she'd accidentally killed Ethan. The news of John Parker's involvement in Ethan's death jolted Emily Parker. "John, why didn't you say something right away?" she howled, keeping her husband away from her. "It's not like you've never smeared your name with something like this. Never stooped to murder. How could you hide it? And you wanted to ruin Michael's life, too. Emily, listen to me." John circled around, trying to explain himself to his wife. But she was adamant. "I don't want to hear it. I'm going to the police." "I'll confess everything today," John Parker declared. "It's been weighing on me. I won't live long with this weight on my soul." John knelt before his wife. This was not easy for such a proud and self-loving man. "Will you sit down?" Emily Parker contradicted herself, fearing for her husband's fate. "But I'll atone for my sin and be clean before the law, and Emma will be out of the news. It wasn't her blow that killed Ethan." The whole family saw my father off at the ward. Sarah didn't hug him goodbye, still reeling from anger and disappointment. "I've earned your forgiveness, daughter," John said goodbye. And Emma decided to meet Sarah with Michael and Lewis after the victorious hearing. "I don't belong among you. I'll wait outside. Where would I go dressed like this?" He looked down at his modest clothing. Lewis didn't look like an alcoholic vagrant who had finally lost touch with reality. He was looking after himself as much as he could in the conditions of a homeless shelter. "I collaborate with the volunteers. Through me, they communicate with our people, rather than rushing to trust strangers. You were deceived once, weren't you? Then you should change." Sarah winked at him. "We'll stop at a barber store and a store on the way. We'll pick you up something?" Best not to argue with her, Michael laughed, noticing Lewis was about to object. Emma had cried right outside the courtroom when it was announced that she no longer had a murder charge hanging over her, and with self-defense, John Parker's confession had helped Emma get her life back on track. Kind called out, "Thank you all so much. If it wasn't for you, Sarah Parker, I'd be locked up for 10 years, Emma sobbed on the shoulder of Niece's former employer. "And to you, Lewis, a special thank you." Emma turned to the man and kissed him heartily on the cheek. When he was brought to order, there was nothing to stop her from regarding him without disgust. "We have reservations at the restaurant," Michael reminded her. "Let's celebrate our release and the change in company life," Emma said. The group, made up of very different people, were surprisingly easy to talk to each other. Emma couldn't stop thanking those gathered. "I want to toast each and every one of you." She raised her glass of champagne as she looked at those in attendance. "Thank you for sticking around and doing your best to rescue me. No one but you could have done it. For freedom," they all echoed. "Lewis, what did you do before?" Sarah asked unashamedly. She didn't feel she had to pity him or sidestep uncomfortable questions. Lewis spoke intelligently, and he knew how to hold his own socially. His leadership position among the homeless made him a confident past professional. 7 years ago, I was a chief accountant for a large firm. Loved my job. Came in almost like a holiday. I love numbers. But when my bosses started having problems with the tax office, they made me look bad by providing black documentation. I had no idea about these papers through which money was being laundered. They gave me a 4-year sentence, and my pregnant wife was left alone without my support. I had an insurmountable fine on me, which began to be seized in the form of various property. Ashley was left without a roof over her head. Relatives took shelter. She was just a few weeks away from giving birth, and her nerves caused her to hemorrhage. Neither she nor the baby were saved, Lewis added quietly, clenching his fists in pain. The personal tragedy still hadn't let go of the man who had unjustly lost everything in an instant. Coming out, I could have tried to challenge the court's decision, but I didn't have the moral strength. The death of my family had crippled me, and I was sheltered on the street by vagrants. Emma was so upset by Lewis's story that they spent the rest of the evening whispering to each other, sharing their feelings about the loss of loved ones and children. It seems two lonely people have found each other's support. Sarah smiled and shifted her gaze to her husband. You should visit your father, Michael told her. Still don't have a concrete position on the situation with John. Yes, he hurt us, but it turned out okay, didn't it? He could have balked and lived his old life, but he cares about his family. You are dear. I'm not ready to forgive him yet, Sarah replied, making it clear she didn't want to talk about it. Sooner or later you'll have to decide that. Please, just don't drown in your resentment. Michael stroked his wife's head and nuzzled her hair. John Parker's lawyer had done his best, getting his client a 14-month sentence. Emily Parker was at first as adamant as her daughter, but then began to visit John often in prison, bringing him something tasty. Totally lost weight, Emily worried, unable to touch her husband during the visits. Don't worry about me. How are the kids doing? Michael doesn't hold a grudge against you, John asked. Sarah, on the other hand, she's still turning her nose up. Won't come over, replied Emily. It's my own fault, sighed John Parker. I'll have to earn her trust. Michael's at the helm now, by the way, and Sarah's helping him. You said his education was nothing, but the boy's a natural. He's brought in a savvy financial advisor named Lewis, our Emma's fiancé. He got Michael up to speed, and now he's a fish out of water in business. Who'd have thought it? He did, the bastard. Lewis has a smart mouth, John said with a smirk. Emily Parker did not exaggerate Michael's merits. Thanks to Lewis's support, he had figured out what was going on in the company and was making lucrative deals one after another, turning his competitors into partners. Business was booming. Within months, the firm's reputation had leveled off. After John confessed to his crime, the young family's finances grew several dozen times over. I wonder what your father would say to that, laughed Michael, choosing in the salon adapted for the disabled car. He had recently been able to pay for his mother's expensive surgery, and Zach had purchased a power wheelchair. Now it was easier for him to get around. Never admit he was wrong, Sarah hummed. But who knows? Maybe he'll get some fatherly feelings. Though Sarah continued to snicker at the mention of her father, in her heart she had long since forgiven him. If Michael had no grievances against his father-in-law, she would let hers go. During their time at the firm, Lewis and Michael became friends, and Sarah and Emma hit it off. Each got their own slice of happiness, moving only forward. What a beautiful table, Egghead Lewis kissing his lover on the lips. What masters you are. Lavushka is mine, Emily Parker stroked his back. Father will be brought in any minute now. Won't Michael be jealous that you're making nice with Lewis? Emma giggled as she watched Emily groom her guest. Everyone awaited John's return from prison. Sarah and Michael had met him at the very gates of the correctional facility and were on their way to his home. When John Parker appeared in the hallway, his wife rushed to hug him back. Dear, welcome back. Emma hugged her father, too, having no more hard feelings. After hugs, tears, and joyful laughter, everyone sat down at the table. John Parker couldn't wait to chat with Lewis, who had helped his son-in-law raise his firm from its knees. Lewis and Emma's wedding day was approaching. There were people constantly hanging around the bride and groom's apartment, advisors on how to organize the celebration. But as worried as Emma was, Sarah quickly weeded out the superfluous. We'll organize everything ourselves, friend. So good to have you. My head is already swelling. Emma complained about the abundance of wedding ideas. At the fabulously beautiful ceremony, only the closest people were present. The tables were set on a country site in the open air. Guests sat under a tent protecting them from the sun. There, sitting with her family, Sarah raised a glass of mineral water and addressed her family. I have a toast. Let's drink to our fathers. Emily smiled at John Parker and then directed a tender look at Michael and to those who will soon be. Are you pregnant? The man rose from his seat. "Yes, honey, we're having a baby boy," Sarah replied. The family immediately began congratulating the parents-to-be, kissing them and showering them with wishes. Emma, as if sensing something, turned to Sarah and sent her friend a kiss. Liz never regretted trading her family for science. And how did she do that? That's what people said. She was sure that both could be perfectly combined, just that her life's work had to come first. Because the family, if you make a step aside, let go, so to speak, the reins, it will not go anywhere from you, but science. Just dare to be not diligent enough of its student and faithful adherent, but just dare. You'll find yourself on the margins. No, Liz had never regretted that her calling had come first. Not until a sudden severe illness had turned her whole world upside down. And now she wondered if it was her own fault that her family treated her so badly. Maybe she should have given more love? Although, she did love. And did she really deserve everything that was happening to her? Liz Tyler had been born into a special kind of family, where whatever generation she came from, whatever branch of the family, they would all be intelligent people, the cream of the crop, so to speak. In any case, it had been so since the end of the 18th century and up to the 20s of the 20th century. And then, in connection with the well-known historical events, much of course changed. The family thinned out. The family was scattered all over the world. Then, however, by the 60s, many things seemed to have been restored to the Tyler family, including a solid position in society, accumulation of all sorts of benefits. But still Liz remembered the words of her grandfather, who said that before, much earlier, everything was different. Liz's peers were not the same, in the sense that they didn't want to obey their elders and continue the family business. They invented all sorts of things. No, look at this. Liz's grandfather Elliot once resented, "How can you become a cook when I told you to be an archaeologist? Maybe you'll rediscover Babylon." And no cake for my anniversary. This bastard will not bribe me. That's how Elliot felt about his son, Uncle Liz. But then, by the way, he graciously forgave him and even admitted that he'd never eaten a cake as delicious as the one his son had made. But still, those were the days when not many people in the Tyler family were doing the great things of the past. Except that Liz was, as Elliot said, completely of their breed. Because she knew from childhood that she was going to be a historian. And she chose a difficult direction, the early Middle Ages in Europe, in its northern regions, with a special focus on folk culture, mythology, tales of that era. Liz remembered that day as if she were running along the path of their cottage, past the tall pines, to the brick house, which from afar looked like a fairy tale castle, so skillfully built was its roof with decorative turrets. This cottage, by the way, was not kept by relatives to whom it was inherited in the 90s, and some strangers sold it, and those even demolished it. They wanted to build their own. But it seems that they did not calculate the money, and then there was some small wooden house in this place. And on the place where there was a luxurious flower garden, once greenhouses were put and grew vegetables for sale. "Grandpa," shouts Liz and throws herself at the old man's neck. "I've passed my last exam. I'm done studying." Elliot laughs, and although he is many years old, it seems like 100, he hugs his granddaughter tightly and pulls her off the ground, spinning her around as if she were 5 years old, and laughs back. What a clever girl. Our breed. Now there will be someone to pass on Princess Pelagia's gold to. Oh, that gold of Princess Pelagia, Tyler's main family treasure. It was said that once it would have been enough for a whole chest. There were heavy bracelets, many rings, necklaces, headbands, braid clips, brooches, precious shoe buckles. But by the will of fate, sometimes unfavorable, by the 70s of the 20th century, when Liz Young just graduated from the university, only a small part of it remained. However, Liz knew it was the biggest treasure in their family, and she was its main heir. And this gold, by the way, was not meant to be worn and walked around in. No way. It was supposed to be always, forever. Must be kept in a tiered casket, a kind of fancy wooden chest on velvet beds. According to family tradition, something of this splendor could be worn only once and only by one person, the eldest daughter or the wife of the eldest son on their wedding day. That's all. And the rest of the time, please keep the family wealth as it should be, because this is not some bling. Elliot's beloved grandfather died when Liz was 27. She'd been sad for him for a long time, because Well, she'd had a good relationship with her parents, but Grandpa was the only one she'd ever been really close to among the entire Tyler family. Parents, by the way, were suddenly the people who wanted to sell the gold. You see, they wanted to buy a check-made wall in the hall, a German kitchen set, and also a car. My parents said that Grandpa was gone and therefore there was no point in following the bourgeois tradition. But Liz stood her ground. She declared that if they touched any of the set, she would no longer be their daughter. My parents were a little shocked. Mom cried and said that she had raised an egoist, dresser, and generally abnormal. Dad looked sternly, coldly, and said he didn't expect such a thing from his own daughter. Liz was both ashamed and... No, Liz was overcome by a thirst to preserve the memory of her grandfather and the family legacy. Liz had loved hearing the legend of how the gold had come into the family, and after that memorable fight with her parents, she had taken the box with it to herself. And all her life she kept it with her in a safe place. After graduation, Liz got a job as an assistant to a historian, Dan, a grandfather's acquaintance. Then, having gained experience and recognition, so to speak, in narrow circles, she began to teach at the university herself. She was known as a strict, ruthless teacher to her students. Liz did not want to get married. She was not interested in all this romantic fuss. But, still, youth took its toll, and at 32 she married Nick. Grandpa Elliot, by the way, this union would hardly approve. Because Nick had nothing to do with the intelligentsia and was a hereditary worker. But he understood Lisa in everything, respected her choice, and they lived soul to soul for exactly 20 years. Until the accident happened, Nick died at work. Just scaffolding construction once collapsed. Meanwhile, it was already the 90s. Liz was left practically alone with her daughter Christy in her arms. While her husband was alive, she had not seen her daughter, but could continue to do her science. The child was looked after by a nanny. Now, there was no money for that. Liz was the sole breadwinner for her small family. And there were no relatives to help her. I mean, there were relatives, acquaintances, but... In fact, she had drifted away from them over the years. In fact, no one was ready to take care of someone else's family. Many people considered Liz strange, almost insane, and reproached her for being too morbidly interested in her history, too high-minded about all the people of more, so to speak, ordinary professions. Liz, having lost her husband, felt the loneliness of it all. But then, after some grieving, she pulled herself together. There was no time to lose heart. She had to write a book about the Viking trek along the Silk Road. Having managed to save money, Liz hired a nanny again and returned to her craft. Her daughter was growing up. And too late, Liz noticed and realized how far she was from her own child. The revelation came suddenly, just one day, on the eve of Christy's high school graduation. Liz had told her to be careful at the party, not to drink any of that stuff, and to go home early. "You should have raised me earlier," snapped at her daughter. "You were never around. What do you know about me? I'm going to be 18 in a month, and that's it. I'm leaving." "Where are you going?" Liz asked in shock. "Anywhere. As long as I get away from here," Christy said and left, slamming the door. She said she would never be such a disgusting mother to her children. Liz felt very strange at the time. She was both angry and offended at her daughter. She was indignant at her ingratitude. She was fed, clothed and clothed as well as anyone else. Should we go to the sea every year for a vacation? Obligatory. With tutors to study to get prospects through education? Absolutely. In general, what was missing? Was it that her mother didn't play dolls with her until she was 14? What the hell is wrong with that girl? Liz hoped that Christy would calm down, apologize, and they would get on with their lives. She also hoped that Christy would stop fooling around and go into a normal profession and become a historian, for example, or maybe a cultural historian, as was the norm in her family. Liz would also approve of such professions as sculptor, architect, restorer. But her daughter was once again unpleasantly surprised. By deciding to become an accountant, the fact that she had carried out her threat and left home to a neighboring town, where she had settled in a dormitory. Liz took offense at first, and then, well, she tried to get in touch. She sent her daughter money. It was well known that students needed it all the time. And slowly, as if they began to communicate a little better. But still, Christy made it clear that she had decided to live on her own, and without any respect almost didn't give a damn about the family heritage. "Who's going to carry on our business?" Liz asked. "What business of ours?" Christy replied with a wicked grin. What a dynasty. They had lived in their own world for generations, despising everyone around them, and what had they done? Do you know that you are considered crazy, like your grandfather Elliot? And him and your great-grandfather. I don't care. What did he see in his life? Dusty books and shards of clay. He was talking nonsense. So Liz was left alone. Suddenly there were no people around. There was a job, though, a destiny, a vocation. And she honestly tried to go headlong into it. All the more so when, after all these years, Grandpa Elliot's diaries turned up. The thing was that they had been handed down from an old friend of his who had died, and his heirs had decided not to throw away such antiques, but to give them to the person to whom they had once belonged. Liz was very surprised by this because she didn't understand why her grandfather would keep his diaries with a stranger, albeit a friend, a colleague. But she took them for herself. As a memory, I looked into them, of course. Most of it was really diary stuff about the weather, the minutiae of life. There were funny stories about lazy students trying to sneak cheat sheets in or cheat on exams, memories of the journeys Elliot had made in his life, some fairy tales written down there. Liz, who had a lot of her own things to do when she returned to the diary family, didn't have time for all that, so she put them away. Meanwhile, time flew by. The daughter, having finished her studies and not thinking of coming back, she decided to settle down in that foreign city. And there she met a man. Liz went and came back in tears because Christy had chosen the wrong man. You see, he was a new businessman. And in Liz's opinion, he looked like a gangster. And he was almost 20 years older than Christy. He was divorced and had a child from a previous relationship. His son's name was Joffrey. All in all, it was hardly a marriage to be happy about. Liz had even hoped that her daughter would come to her senses and divorce. But it didn't happen. But she had children, first a girl, whom she named Maggie, and then a son, Sami. Maybe you should move to our town. One day on the phone, Liz suggested to her daughter, I'd be closer to my family. I could help with the grandchildren. Why, Mom, are you retired already? Christy asked. Would you give up your job to devote yourself to your grandchildren? What do you mean? Liz didn't understand. I was just thinking. Don't think. Christy laughed. What's the point of me living with you? To fill my children's heads with the same nonsense. You think I don't know that you can't help me? You couldn't raise your own daughter properly. What grandchildren for you? However, fate had it that Liz did get close to her daughter's family, but it didn't work out the way she wanted it to. Christy had called one day and asked in an unexpectedly pitiful, begging voice if she could come to town with her husband's son from his first marriage. The thing was that the boy was diagnosed with a rare disease, and in that small town where Christy lived, just did not have the right specialists. Well, come, of course. Everybody come. Liz rejoiced. That is, she was happy that her daughter was coming with her own grandchildren. And the arrival of that stranger's child, she wasn't happy at all. Christy arrived, taking up her room in the large 2-bedroom apartment where the Tylers had lived for decades. Liz did her best to make the guests feel welcome, putting the best stuff on the table, offering to show off the town to the guys. Except that neither Maggie nor Sami were particularly happy to see their grandmother. They did not look like loving grandchildren. They were capricious, ill-mannered, rude boys. Maggie, at 9, to Liz's horror, had no table manners at all, but she could swear foully and ugly. And Sami, who was 7, was always messing up all the things he could get his hands on. Joffrey, not her own grandson, was not the man Liz had expected him to be. He was a tall boy for his 12 years. He had blonde hair, glasses, and a nose full of freckles. He was quiet, polite, and silent. Unlike his brother and sister, he was the only one who said he would be happy if Grandma showed him the town. Liz shrugged and decided it wouldn't hurt her to take him somewhere. Shall we go to the park? She asked. Would you like to go on the rides? Could we go to the art gallery? Joffrey asked, and Liz opened her mouth. I didn't expect that. While her own grandchildren spent all their free time watching cartoons and silly shows on TV, this grandson read books and listened intently and thoughtfully to Liz's stories about the Tyler family. Sometimes it seemed to Liz that Joffrey was even more like their family's ancestors than Christy and her children, Liz was genuinely concerned about Geoffrey's health problems, and when it became clear that he needed money for his medication, she withdrew the necessary amount from her bank account without question. And when it was time for Christy and the kids to go home, Liz saw them off with tears in her eyes and called them to come back again. Time flew on. Liz was now fully retired. Age was making itself felt. What used to seem like a simple ailment suddenly became a disease. And although Liz still had acquaintances in her circle, the same scientists, but they were all old, and after she left the university, after she stopped working, communication with them slowly came to naught. But what was surprising and frightening at the same time for Liz was that it was as if she didn't notice the passage of time. That is, she realized, of course, that another year had passed, another year, and so on, but this realization came on abruptly and painfully, as if the passage of time was also a kind of disease. And sometimes, especially in the evenings, it was almost physically unbearable for Liz to be alone in the big apartment. Then memories came back, about how nice it used to be here. Lots of family, guests, friends. And now? Books and cupboards, statues, paintings, everything the Tylers had saved up, preserved with great effort over decades of family history. Liz wondered more and more often who would get it all after she died. What would become of it all? As time slowly moved on. One day, everything finally and abruptly changed. It was at the end of winter, when it seemed there was no ice left on the street at all. But Liz's foot somehow found it, and the old woman fell awkwardly. The ambulance took her to the hospital, and the doctors determined it was a very compound fracture first, and a damaged back second. Liz, feeling helpless, lonely, called her daughter. Yes, a social worker visited her, but it was clearly not enough. And then Liz made up her mind. Christy has had many changes in her life over the years, by the way. She separated from her first husband and remarried, and in pursuit of her feminine happiness, she moved far away. What do you want? I can't just jump up and come to you, replied Christy to her mother. Maybe you need to go to some pension for the elderly? Christy said that she had no time and that she did not understand how a mother could be so irresponsible. After all, in the boarding house, at least care and supervision of her will be. But if she will sit alone in her apartment and something else happens to her, then how can she be? And then, a few days after this difficult conversation, Liz was contacted by Christy's children. Maggie called. The granddaughter seemed very disturbed by what had happened to her grandmother and said that here she was in person available and could come and live with her, look after her. Thank you, darling. Come on over, Liz replied. Maggie said she would buy the tickets as soon as she hung up the phone. She added that she'd come with Sami because he needed to see his grandmother too. And Geoffrey should come too, said Liz. Maggie hesitated and said that, actually, Geoffrey was busy at the moment, he was studying. But then she agreed that yes, perhaps he should tell her what had happened. I don't understand you, though, Maggie added. Why? He's no one. Liz disagreed. She didn't think of Geoffrey as a stranger. Even if they didn't see each other often, maybe once or twice a year, there was something about him that made him different from her grandchildren. Something that made her think of Elliot's grandfather. I mean, really, Liz had been looking at old photos recently and could have sworn that Geoffrey and Elliot were practically the same face. Finally, the grandchildren had arrived. Liz was ready to forget all the misunderstandings they'd had in the past because now she didn't feel lonely again. Maggie quickly took matters into her own hands, asking how her health was doing. How was everything in general? After a few weeks, however, Liz also began to realize that things were not as smooth as they had seemed at first. For one thing, Maggie seemed to have little patience. No, she didn't insult her grandmother in a direct way, but she could give her a sharp answer and tell her not to bother her with silly conversations. Sami was almost never home at all, and when Liz tried to find out where her grandson was, Maggie replied that it was none of her business. The only person in whose company Liz felt truly comfortable was Geoffrey. He was already 23 years old and was graduating from university, and he wanted to become a professional jeweler. It's a very good profession, Liz praised his choice once again. Our grandfather Elliot's great-grandfather's cousin was a jeweler. He even made jewelry for the English royal family. You're very capable, Geoffrey. You'll do very well. Only Geoffrey, by the way, Liz had shown the Tyler family treasure Princess Pelagia's gold more than once and more than twice, and only he willingly listened to the legend that told how they were created in the first place and how they got to the Tylers. Maggie and Sami, however, were also interested in gold, but purely for practical purposes. First of all, they asked what Grandma, she would bequeath them any of it, right? Liz was confused and replied confusedly that it went without saying that the jewelry would go to her relatives after her. "Why don't you sell them now?" Sami once asked, and his eyes ran strangely. "Why shouldn't the gold sit idle?" Liz gasped with indignation. How dare he call a centuries-old heritage just gold and say such a thing? At first, Liz thought that she would live much better in the company of her grandchildren, who had come to look after her while she recovered. But she soon realized that this was not the case. Somehow, very quickly, her pension was at the disposal of her grandchildren. And according to them, everything in the stores was terribly expensive, which is why her pension was running out so quickly. Liz, who used to buy everything herself before the grandchildren arrived, naturally wondered whether prices had risen so quickly. "Well, Grandma, what do you want?" Maggie shook her head. "And besides, we look after you here. We don't work, by the way. We live on our own money. Do you think it's easy?" What else was an old woman to do? She sighed and tried not to talk about money anymore, especially since there was still some savings in the account, so. "Joffrey, I want to give you power of attorney for the money," Liz said one day. "I don't want to say anything bad about your brother and sister. They're here. They're looking after me. They even took me to the clinic for scans. But only." Grandma Joffrey interrupted her. "I realize that maybe I'm wrong to say this. Just don't encourage that couple too much, okay?" And then Joffrey explained to the old lady what the matter was. And the point was that Maggie hadn't worked while she was living in her hometown. Yeah, she was a student. But then she was expelled for failing grades. And for a while she lived with her boyfriend, or rather with a man, a market trader, who was a good 10 years older than her. Then he kicked her out and Maggie went back to her father. Sami didn't go anywhere at all. It was like he was looking for himself. And Joffrey said that his half-brother had a bad habit of drinking, just like his father. How Liz gasped. "I've never seen him drunk." "He's clever," Joffrey explained. "He drinks beer in the evening when no one can see him. But if he's like his father, he won't stop there." "And you? Don't you drink?" Liz asked cautiously. No, Joffrey shook his head and his eyes sparkled. "My mother took me to an old man in the village when I was a child. He healed me of the scourge." "I didn't realize you were so superstitious." Liz grinned. "I'm not superstitious, I just use every opportunity to improve my life," said Joffrey thoughtfully, "regardless of their origin. Unless it's criminal, of course." Then the grandson returned to the subject of the conversation. He said that Maggie and Sami had discussed among themselves that, theoretically, Grandma's apartment was worth a lot of money, and it was not wise for her to live here alone in her old age. He said they wanted to split it up and evict Liz. That's enough. Grandmother was suddenly angry. She couldn't listen to any more bad things being said about her grandchildren. They weren't perfect people, but they were still her own blood. Suddenly Liz thought that maybe Joffrey wasn't entirely pure of spirit. Maybe he was deliberately speaking ill of his brother and sister. They're nobody to him. Maybe he's the one who wants to take over everything. Liz was so nervous that she said it all to Joffrey's face. He listened carefully. He didn't deny it, didn't take offense. He just said he was clean, he knew it, and that was enough for him. He had taken a leave of absence to look after his grandmother, and he seemed to be coping well with those duties. "But if you trust them more than you trust me, if you think I'm unnecessary, then I can leave," Joffrey said quietly, leaving the room, and that was the end of their conversation. Liz's heart was troubled because she knew she had hurt her grandson, but she was also the kind of person who wasn't used to being the first to apologize. Liz's health, meanwhile, was getting better and worse. In fact, she could get up on her own. She could walk to the bathroom, to the toilet, but sometimes she was wobbly, dizzy, and Liz realized that at this rate she would be sick until the summer, and maybe even until the fall. And even more anxious in her heart, she realized what to do. Couldn't the young people really live here with her forever? but the thought of going to some specialized boarding house for the elderly was unbearable. Gradually, insomnia was added to the malaise. Liz could lie in bed until morning, remembering that. There was a time in her life. There had been a special time in her life when she had almost chosen a different fate for herself. She had barely been a student then. She came, I remember, to one of her first classes. "Move over, please," said young Liz to a young red-haired guy who was sitting at the desk and had so sat down, so arranged his books and notebooks, that there was no room for her. "You can do it," said the boy, and he looked up at her with his piercing evil eyes, which instantly made him look like a cunning fox. "I'll let you in for a kiss." Liz's jaw dropped at the insolence, the shamelessness. She was about to angrily reprimand the scoundrel, but then he smiled in a completely disarming way. "Just kidding. Sit down, of course." And she sat down. There was no time to look for another seat in the auditorium. The professor had already arrived. Soon Liz was informed by her classmates about who the redhead was. His name was Alex Weiss, and he was the son of a fashion model and a man from abroad, or rather a businessman from Sweden. Now he lived with his mother, but he often went to visit his father. His father often gave him gifts. That's why Alex was dressed fashionably and everything imported. That's why everyone wanted to be friends with him. "He's generous," said Lillian, one of the students. "He takes girls to restaurants." "I'm not going to a restaurant with him," Liz snorted. But it turned out that Alex had plans to go to a restaurant with Liz. He invited her and also gave her flowers. She said no. Once, twice, a second time, a third time, a fourth time. "Okay," Alex said and smiled as completely conquering as he had the first time. "Then let's go to my cottage." Liz almost hit him on the head with a bouquet of tiger lilies for such insolence. But Alex saved himself by quickly explaining the situation. His father had come to visit him. He and his mother had gone to the dacha and said that Alex could call all the friends he wanted. "There are a lot of old books there," Alex said. "I thought you might be interested in naming," and he named a couple of books that took Liz's breath away. They were terribly rare editions that even Grandpa Elliot didn't have. "Okay," she said, licking her lips nervously. "So it's no big deal? Just a visit?" "I swear I'll behave like a knight." He bowed jokingly. "Do you think I don't know what knights often seek before the lady of their heart?" Liz asked with a squint. She went to the cottage. And everything was really very decent there. They grilled kebabs, went boating, sang to the guitar by the fire. The young people didn't hooliganize, and the adults didn't disturb them. In the end, they themselves needed to be alone with each other. "How can your mother do that?" sighed Liz, who suddenly found this story of love with a foreigner very romantic. "Why didn't she go to him and take you with her?" "She doesn't want to. She has grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, and other relatives here," Alex answered. "She says that I'll finish my studies and then I'll decide where I'll live." Then Alex took his special guest to look at books. Liz's hands were trembling with excitement. It was so magical to touch old books. And it turned out that she and Alex had more common interests than it seemed before. So he too knew the legend of Princess Pelagia's gold. However, he said that he had a book in which the legend is set out in a form somewhat different from the generally accepted version. "And what is in it?" Liz asked curiously. Alex told her everything and even let her read it. In the version that Liz had known since childhood, Pelagia was the only princely daughter, and the gold she had gotten as a dowry had been cursed by another maiden. That other maiden, named Amelie, was the daughter of a goldsmith and had the misfortune to fall in love with the same guy Pelagia had been married to. Legend has it that this curse was supposed to bring misfortune to the young family, but salvation came from the fact that Pelagia and Nick, although married by the will of their parents, but over time really managed to love each other, and that's why the evil spells were not afraid of them. And the Tylers, according to this legend, were the direct descendants of this very Pelagia. However, the book in Alex's collection said something different. Pelagia was the daughter of a prince, yes, that was true. And she had a fiancé who was married off. But Amelie was not the daughter of a goldsmith, but a girl from Pelagia's maids, and her love for Nikita struck her after he had become the husband of the prince's daughter. Amelie, consumed with jealousy, angry at the fact that life is so unfair some all, and others nothing. Sometimes, when no one saw her, she took out the casket with Pelagia's dowry and tried on her jewelry, imagining that she had become so rich and noble suddenly, as in a fairy tale. One day she was caught by Nick himself. Naturally, the poor girl was frightened. But the young master was not angry. And then Amelie tried on the jewelry again. Now Nick himself allowed her to fool around like that, and also gave her a silk handkerchief, and by the way again asked for payment for everything in the form of a kiss. So it went on for a long time, until one day Pelagia suddenly found that from her chest of drawers missing ring with a ruby, and it was her favorite among all the magnificent jewelry. Naturally, they started looking for it. The ring was found in Amelie's mattress. Pelagia might have forgiven the poor girl, but she did not hold back and said everything she thought about her mistress, and also said that the young master became so cold to Pelagia because he had long loved another. At that time, by the way, Nick was not at the estate, he had gone hunting. Pelagia was furious. She said that if Amelie was so sure that Nick loved her, if she was so sure that he would save her from anywhere, if she wanted to own the gold herself. Well, you shall have it all, said Pelagia gloomily. She ordered the maid to be dressed in a silk dress, to braid pearls in her braid, and to put on her gold jewelry from the chest. And then she ordered her to take her into the forest and there to be chained to a tree, to leave her for the wolves to prey on. Let it be so, said Pelagia, looking at the unfortunate victim from the height of a raven mare, on which she sat in a lady's saddle of scarlet morocco. If Nick finds you, I will not interfere with your happiness. Run to the ends of the earth with him, and take the gold. I don't want it. It'll be yours. Maybe it'll bring you happiness. But if the wolves find you before, well then, that's your fate. And Pelagia and her faithful servants rode off. Amelie stayed in the thicket of the forest, and soon she heard the howling of wolves. She did not know that Nick was not so far away. He was hunting, and just chased one wolf. It was a huge old beast. Nick and his friends had already killed its family, a she-wolf and her cubs, and now he was eager to get the skin of the beast. Nick had already imagined how he would dress it better and throw it at the feet of his Amelie. And it so happened that Nick's horse got ahead, and his companions, also dashing hunters, lagged behind. And then, suddenly Nick flew into the clearing. One awkward step, it was a hole, a burrow of some beast met, and the horse flew, fell down, the rider over his head tumbled. And then Nick, barely rising, saw what was happening in the clearing. He saw Amelie standing by a tree, and a wolf that stood on its hind legs and opened its huge, toothy maw, breathing in her face. Nick looked behind him for his bow and arrow, but both remained on the saddle and the horse. He had run away because he was afraid of the wolf. Nick reached for his belt. There should have been a dagger there, but he remembered that he had lost it in the battle with the she-wolf, and he realized that he was unarmed. "Don't touch her," Nick shouted, as if the wolf could understand human speech. "Let go of my beloved, and then I'll let you go." The beast clamped his ears, growled muffled, and then suddenly rushed into the thicket. Nick rushed to the girl. He untangled the ropes, patted her white cheeks, and brought her to her senses. Amelie told him everything. "Now you have nothing more to fear," said Nick. "Let's go out of the woods and then decide how to proceed." And they walked slowly. They thought that they were about to meet Nick's companions, but the forest was silent, as if it had all died out. The sun, meanwhile, was waning towards sunset, but before its disk touched the horizon, the edge of the forest appeared. Nick, with a joyful cry, rushed towards it. Just for a moment he took his hand away from Amelie's hand. Just for a moment he left it behind his back. There was a terrible cry. Nick turned around and saw that Amelie was lying on the ground, and above her standing the same wolf. The man and the predator looked into each other's eyes. And suddenly Nick's head was pierced by a sharp pain. A foreign, heavy, rumbling like thunder voice broke into it, which said, "You did not spare my beloved, my little ones, so why should I spare yours?" A moment later, the wolf took a powerful leap and disappeared into the forest. Nick rushed to his beloved, but Amelie was no longer breathing, and then the other hunters arrived. There were shouts, noise. But how much that wolf was not looking for, and could not find a single trace of it, as if through the ground fell through. Nick returned to his lawful wedded wife. He told her everything. "I will continue to be your husband," he said, and threw at her feet jewelry, which he took off immediately. "But I'm afraid our bloodline is now cursed." Legend had it that the jewelry that had been preserved for posterity since Pelagia's time did not always bring misfortune to everyone. But sometimes it happened that they seemed to come to life. That is, the old curse came to life. And then families were destroyed because of the gold, and relatives began to fight among themselves like hungry wolves. Liz was very impressed with this version of the legend. It was much darker, and, despite all the folktale elements, somehow it even seemed more realistic. And since that day, Liz suddenly realized that she felt sympathy for Alex, and that sympathy soon turned into love. Except that love never had a chance. Because one day Alex announced that he had made a decision he was going to his father. It's better that way. "What about me?" Liz asked. "What if I ask you to stay?" "You're too young," he replied with a chuckle. "But we're about the same age," she objected indignantly. "You don't understand," Alex sighed. "You're a nice girl, Liz, but you and I, it's not going to work out. But you know what? Let me tell you something. I'll always be a good friend to you, even 100 years from now." "I'll need you in 100 years, old grandfather," Liz grumbled. Contrary to her own expectations, for some reason she didn't feel pain at the refusal, but only disappointment and some light sadness, as if this refusal was destined by fate itself. Alex said that he would always and forever remain her friend, and that if one day in her life there would be hard times, she could turn to him. And he even said that he would bequeath the same to his children, that they should consider Liz their friend, and if Alex was no longer in the world, that they would help her if she needed it. Liz said she only wanted Alex to leave her alone forever. But then, before he left, she added that it was okay. Maybe she would see him again someday. "I'm not coming for help," Liz said. "I'm inviting you to my wedding, so you can see how happy I've become." Liz had such big, bright plans for her life. But she didn't invite Alex to the wedding. She thought, why would she? Why bring up the past? They were so young and stupid, talking such nonsense. Some stupid oaths he'd made up about helping her. That's for legends and stories, not for real life. And then, the day after her wedding, Liz hid the sheet with Alex's address and phone number far away, at the bottom of the box where the gold was kept. Liz couldn't understand why she remembered that particular part of her life. And then she realized, because she couldn't help but wonder how things would have turned out if Alex had become her husband then, if he hadn't rejected her. Would she probably have a different daughter, not Christy, and different grandchildren? Maybe she would be sitting on a veranda somewhere in Sweden, surrounded by a large, friendly family and drinking tea, looking at the blossoming garden. And now what's here? Or, no matter how you spin it, you can't escape your fate. Some more time passed. And Liz began to notice that she was feeling better. Slowly, little by little, but she felt better. Now she could go out to the entrance and sit on the bench. But there were other grandmothers sitting there, and she had nothing to talk to them about, because they all talked about their own things about medicines, prices in stores, and she, Liz, was not interested in such things. But she, Liz, at least had some fun sitting like that. And then one day at home, a terrible thing happened. It all started with Sami coming home drunk. In fact, Liz had sent her grandchildren to the store to buy something for the festive table. Her birthday was approaching, and the old lady wanted to celebrate it modestly. But as it happened, Geoffrey, who had left home earlier, he had gone to the other side of town to buy medicine for his grandmother. When he came back, he was furious. He started telling off his brother and sister. There was a fight. And then they all fought. And Liz was sure that Geoffrey had started it. She'd yelled at him too, telling him to be more tolerant of his relatives. Tolerant? Geoffrey was so indignant and tense that his face was even blotchy. What kind of people are they, Grandma? They should be thrown out. Oh, we're talking, Maggie said with her arms at her sides. You want to get your own place, don't you? What do you mean? Liz didn't understand. And then it was explained to her. It turned out that Geoffrey had gone to the lawyers to consult. He wanted to know if it was possible to arrange it so that Liz could write a gift quickly, just. Anyway, he wanted her to give him the apartment. Grandmother Geoffrey sighed. I can explain everything, really. You've got it all wrong. I just want to make sure. To keep you safe. If you gave me the apartment, he said, pointing his finger at his brother and sister, wouldn't be able to get it. They wouldn't be able to get it. And you would continue to live here in complete safety. And he also found out about the nursing home. Liz almost fainted at these words. She hadn't expected such treachery from the man she had thought for years to be better than her own grandchildren. Grandmother Joffrey stepped toward her, but Liz recoiled. I didn't ask about a nursing home, but about a clinic, a vacation home, so that you could improve your health and then. That's it. Get away from me. Liz was hysterical. What the hell are you thinking? No, you're not my grandson anymore. Maggie, granddaughter, take me to bed. I don't feel well. Joffrey tried to explain that his intentions were purest, that he just wanted to keep Liz safe from people who really wanted to hurt her. Except she didn't listen to him. She wailed, she cried. And then she told Joffrey in a harsh, scathing voice that she renounced him, that he was a stranger to her, and that she was sorry that her daughter, Christy, had been a good stepmother to such a monster for so many years. Joffrey listened attentively and silently. He didn't try to object. He didn't try to defend himself or justify himself in any other way. And Liz took it all as a confirmation of his guilt. Get out of my house, she said at the end. And the grandson didn't leave. He just packed up and left. Silently, without saying goodbye. Liz cried bitterly. Maggie fussed with her heart drops. Sami had said it was for the best, that everything would be all right now. What Liz didn't see was that her grandson and granddaughter looked at each other for a moment, and their faces contorted into a wicked grin. In the evening, Liz felt sick at heart and had to call an ambulance. The doctors, who had been briefed on the situation very roughly and one-sidedly, said that of course stress at that age is extremely harmful to the body, so the old lady just needed to rest. And for a few days the sick Liz spent like in a dream. And then something else happened. That evening it was raining outside the window. It seemed like a flood. There was thunder. All in all, it was a very unfavorable weather atmosphere. An hour ago she had asked Maggie to make her some herbal remedies for insomnia, but her granddaughter had not yet fulfilled her grandmother's wish. And Liz had no idea why Sami had returned drunk again. Apparently Maggie was having a talk with him now, as voices could be heard coming from the kitchen. Liz climbed out of bed. Overcome with weakness, she wanted a cup of tea. She could use a snack, like a cheese sandwich. But she did not dare to call Maggie again. She would rather let her brother take care of him. She must save the boy, lest he should get into this trouble. And she, Liz, would get there by herself. Nothing would happen to her. Noiselessly, the old woman left her room and moved, holding on to the wall, into the kitchen. She could hear the voices clearly now. It was only a short distance from the door to the kitchen, but then Liz froze, because strange words came to her ears. I'm sick of the old one, Maggie said. Cleaning her up, washing her. She stinks. I'm tired. All day long, I'm tied up at home like a leash. And I'm still young. I want to live. Yes, we've been sitting here too long, said Sami with a grin. Good thing that idiot left. I thought he would ruin everything. What are we going to do? Asked the granddaughter. The old woman's gold should be divided, and she should be taken to the city dump, said Sami. No, you imagine how much gold there will be there, eh? To the dump. Maggie repeated after her brother thoughtfully. You don't mean that literally, do you? And who knows me? Sami chuckled. Well, maybe not to the dump, but to a shelter. There are free do not know, and I don't want to pay. I'm sick of everything, said Maggie. I thought my grandmother would give me something to eat. Have you seen how many old books and clothes there are? What's the use? They're all junk. They should be taken to the dump. And sell the apartment. Sami banged his fist. Fool, said Maggie. Maybe there's something antique. Sometimes they pay big money for such things. The rich get fat, Sami replied. Something rumbled and clinked in the kitchen, as if they were pouring a drink from a bottle. It was about time that idiot was kicked out by his grandmother. He wanted to be the first to get a piece. Want some? Poor Maggie said. No, I don't think he wanted to steal. He probably wanted to save the old woman. What an idiot. Who the hell is he? Nothing, Sami chuckled. She kicked him out. Now he won't save her. Now we'll decide everything by ourselves. That's enough. The old woman has lived and lived. It's time for us to get everything. And the gold is the most important. Maybe it's worth $1 million. What do you think? Liz didn't remember how, but she walked quietly back. She closed the door and lay on the bed, stretched out on her back, her arms folded across her chest. She heard her heart thudding knock, 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 knock beneath her hands, and she thought it would stop once. And it would stop now. What she heard was like a forest fire that consumes the young growth. It was like a tub of water being splashed on a freshly painted canvas, and it washed away all the colors. Liz's world turned upside down, back and forth, spinning and falling somewhere. The old woman couldn't get it into her head. Was this happening to her? Was it not a terrible dream? Or maybe it was really a dream? Maybe she fell asleep to a program that tells about how soulless and heartless sometimes children and grandchildren are, and that's how she dreamed it. How much time had passed, Liz didn't know. But judging by the way the moon moved across the sky and peered through the window with its ghostly disk, it was already night. The door opened and a dark silhouette peered into the dark room. Liz had turned off the lights when she returned. "Grandma, are you asleep?" the silhouette asked in Maggie's voice. Liz held her breath, hiding on the bunk, pretending to sleep, because she knew for sure that if she said a word or glanced at it now, it would be the end. Maggie would realize that she'd heard everything. And then what would happen to her? What would they do to her? The morning of the next day was clear and sunny. The weather was so sunny that one could think that the universe itself was smiling at you, looking in the window. So stop sulking. Get up. Live life to the fullest. But this morning seemed just black to Liz. She waited with fear for Maggie to look in on her, and when her granddaughter came, Liz was shaking every moment. What if she realized from her eyes that she knew everything? But Maggie didn't seem to know anything. She fed Liz with semolina porridge on water as usual, because she was on a diet, gave her tea, gave her another piece of bread, and said she was going to go to the store. She added about her brother, saying that Sami had gone to see if there was any need for laborers at the market. "I can't live on your pension alone," you know, Maggie sighed, pretending to be sad. "I don't know how we're going to get by." "I'm almost well now," granddaughter Liz smiled shyly, her lips trembling. "Thank you, my darlings, for helping me to get back on my feet. You'll soon be able to come home. I'm used to being on my own for years." "What are you talking nonsense, grandmother?" Maggie laughed, but her eyes were not merry and cold. "This is our home. We are, after all, your heirs." "No, grandmother," Maggie wagged her finger at her. "We're not going anywhere from you now. We're not going anywhere. We're going to keep a close eye on you." "Well, I'm off. I'm young. I have to be on time for everything." Liz was as quiet as a mouse until Maggie packed up and left the house. When the key clicked in the lock, the old woman exhaled long and hard. Oh, how she wanted to feel sorry for herself, to sit and cry. But I realized, this is not the case. She had to hurry. She had to save herself before her grandson and granddaughter threw away the Tyler family's legacy. Rising carefully, Liz reached the closet, pulled up a chair. Oh, scary. At her age, falling from such a height could kill you. But her body didn't let her down, and so Liz took a large shoebox from the top of the closet. It was junk, but it held what was dearer to her than anything else in the world: Princess Pelagia's gold. She untangled the old shawls and handkerchiefs that wrapped the carved wooden chest. It had been a long, long time since she had looked in it. Perhaps 5 years already. And why would she do that? Lately, contact with the family history had been painful, stirring up unnecessary memories, making her question the decisions she'd once made. Liz knew there were priceless treasures under the lid, and a notebook with the address and phone number of a man she'd sworn she'd never ask for help. And actually, this is all so silly. Well, really. Alex, then Liz realized she had to call. She had to call. Slowly, tautly, the lid lifted with the creak of ancient wood. Liz knew what she must see: the dull glow of gold in the midday sun. But what appeared before her? The old woman froze, her eyes rounded. Her heart skipped a beat. No, it was impossible. It couldn't be. But the sight did not lie, and she reached into the casket with a trembling hand and took out something she had not expected to find. Not that Joffrey was prepared for such a development, but he sensed that if Granny knew what he was up to, she wouldn't give him a hard time. Because Liz, unfortunately, is too kind and somewhat naive in a person who is in the captivity of his own illusions. Therefore, Geoffrey only had to be extremely careful. But at some point, things didn't go according to plan. And he, damn it, was not even allowed to explain himself normally with his grandmother. He wanted to lash out at the two vultures who had the nerve to call themselves Grandma Liz's grandson and granddaughter, but he didn't. Because he realized that this time there would be no victory on his side. And in order to be able to continue to do everything normally, and not to ruin the relationship with his grandmother under the influence of others, Geoffrey decided to leave her house. Just for a while, just for a day or two. And then, it was only necessary to buy time, when the vulture's damned vultures would not be in the apartment and could talk to his grandmother about everything. That was Geoffrey's plan. And it wasn't bad at all. The guy stood at the bus stop under its iron visor and waited for the bus. While he was waiting for transportation, he went to the internet via smartphone and renewed the lease of a daily apartment, which he had already looked for a long time because it was getting harder and harder to live in an apartment. And Geoffrey decided that he would live there first, and then he would probably rent an apartment for a longer period of time because he would have to stay in the city for his grandmother's business. Geoffrey was heartily grateful to the university authorities, who, having heard about his family's circumstances, granted him a leave of absence without any criticism or reproach. Raising the collar of his jacket, it was pouring rain. Geoffrey stretched his neck, looking for the bus. And then, everything happened in a flash. Just one car at the crossroads suddenly lost control, probably because of the wet road, or maybe something happened to the brakes, but it was suddenly carried to the side. People from the bus stop scattered. Geoffrey, immersed in his thoughts, hesitated. And then there was a blow, a flash of deafening pain and darkness. "Am I all right?" was the first thing Geoffrey asked when he woke up. And he asked it for two reasons. First, there was no pain in his body, which was naturally suspicious after such a collision. And second, there was a marvelous golden-haired creature leaning over him, who could easily be mistaken for a guide to a better world. Like those who are dying to lead through the tunnel to the eternal light. Alive and not even broken, which is amazing, said a gruff voice, and the marvelous creature was displaced by a bearded man in a hospital gown. The doctor, and it was he, introduced himself to Harry and told him that Geoffrey had been lucky to get away with a few bruises and a suspected concussion. All he had to do was not cross the road at a red light. What? Geoffrey's eyes widened. The car lost control. No, the doctor frowned. Don't you start laying blame on me. Eyewitnesses saw you step into the roadway thinking about something. They called out to you, but you ran like a rhinoceros right into the car, which did lose control a little. Yeah, Geoffrey squirmed guiltily against the cushions, remembering that he'd been so absorbed in thought that he'd taken a careless step forward. So, if it hadn't been for my own stupidity, it wouldn't have hit me, maybe. And who is this? He asked and wanted to stretch his neck. Because the broad shoulders of the doctor blocked the golden-haired woman, but immediately shrieked from the shooting pain in his neck. The one you scared to death, replied the girl. And the perpetrator of the incident, apparently. What? Geoffrey smiled weakly. No, they say it was my own fault, said the girl. And I'm to blame, said the girl. I should have minimized speed in the rain, but I just did not expect. So don't argue now, okay? Gennady said sternly. Why did I allow you to see the patient at all? In general, will you write a claim for damage to health? The guilty party is ready to pay for all treatment, and also compensation for moral damage. The girl nodded hastily. But the last thing Geoffrey could think about now was money. No one else was hurt, the girl said. Well, just my car had hit a concrete fence. Are you all right? Shrieked Geoffrey. As you can see, she smiled charmingly. The airbag didn't fail. Well, here's my phone. With these words, she put a sheet on the bedside table. I'll be in touch. I won't run away. And here's one more thing. She dug into her purse and pulled out a wad of bills. I withdrew it from the nearest ATM. It's here, near the hospital. I keep the rest at home, in cash. I'll bring it all back by tonight. Wait a minute, Geoffrey squinted. his head spinning as if he'd been forced on a merry-go-round for hours on end. "What's your name?" Larry replied, a beautiful woman with a golden mane of curly hair who looked to be in her early 20s. "And now, please, the visiting hours are all ready." Gennady got into the conversation again. "You can come back later. And right now the young man needs rest and I must tell him about his condition. Further necessary observation, treatment." "Yes, of course." Larry's making a fuss. "Get well and..." "Forgive me, I'm sorry, it's just terrible," she added from the doorway. Geoffrey smiled weakly at her. He didn't feel sick and broken. On the contrary, light as a cloud. "Don't get too excited," the doctor warned. "Soon the effect of drugs will go down and I'll feel every bone. But don't worry, we'll find you some weaker painkillers. In the meantime, let's talk about this. Who are your contacts?" "No," said Geoffrey. "I'm from out of town. My father's there, but he won't be able to come for sure." "That's too bad," the doctor shook his head. "Someone has to take care of you. You'll be out of the hospital soon." "I'm renting an apartment," Geoffrey went on. "I was thinking of renting for a long time. I have a grandmother in town." "That's great. We'll let my grandmother know." "No," exclaimed the boy, and seeing how the doctor's eyebrows went up, explained. "She can't worry, she's sick herself and there's no point anyway. She and we had a very big quarrel." "Would you like me to share an observation? As a doctor who's been here for 20 years, no matter how much relatives fight, usually when someone goes to the hospital, all the fuss and misunderstandings go away. Relatives, usually do not abandon." "Well, all right," Geoffrey sighed. "But let's do it tomorrow already. Grandma, she thinks I'm just sitting in my apartment anyway, and she's not going to come looking for me today." Liz felt like a complete fool, an idiot, as she dialed that very phone number. She was well aware of how much time had passed and that it could have been changed 100 times already. And anyway, in the age of digital technology, it was reasonable to assume that instead of a landline phone, everyone was using a cell phone, which meant that the only way to get in touch with Alex, if he was still alive at all, would be to send a letter. And he might not have lived at that address for decades, and how long that letter would take. And yet, Liz dialed the number. "You old fool," she told herself after the 6th ringtone, but the receiver was suddenly picked up. They answered in English, and Liz's mind was so out of foreign language it was like a foreign language. The other end asked, "Who is this?" and probably would have hung up, thinking it was a prank call, but then Liz finally pulled herself together and asked Alex. "Who is it?" they asked. "You see, Grandpa's not very well." "But is he sane?" Liz blurted out, suddenly afraid that Alex might, theoretically, be suffering from dementia. Liz, almost crying, began to apologize and say that she was just an old acquaintance of his, and she didn't think that she would catch him after so many years, and she was very, very sorry for the indelicacy, but if you can, tell him that it's Lizonka calling, the same one who once visited him at his dacha. "All right," said a man's voice on the other side, uncertainly. "I'll ask my grandfather now." "Wait, okay?" Liz thanked Mikhail, the man who had introduced himself as Alex's son, and waited. Her heart was beating fast and it seemed too heavy. Is he going to tell her something? And in general, why is she calling him? What does he recognize as time an old man? Can she, an old woman from his distant past, help her now? He lives in another country. This is ridiculous. No, Liz thought she should end the call now, tear the sheet with the number, and address to shreds, forget the whole thing and try to. Liz? The voice she heard was exactly as she remembered it, and for a split second the past and the future seemed to blend together. "Alex," Liz breathed out. You're alive." Liz couldn't take it anymore, and she started to cry. "Okay, first of all, calm down." His voice was as stern as it was soothing. "I suppose you didn't call me for the first and only time after all these years to talk about Silver Age poetry. Tell me what happened, and we'll figure out what to do next." Geoffrey hated being sick. It came from his childhood when his father, under the influence of his neighbor Aunt Ducia, a great admirer of folk medicine, had treated his flu with steam from a pot of potatoes and some disgusting fat dissolved in hot milk. And so, although the hospital was clean and even fed good food, and the neighbors on the ward were quiet and decent, and although the nurse was young and cheerful, but from the face of Geoffrey still did not go sour, dissatisfied with everything in the world Mina. Naturally, it was necessary to settle all the formalities that he had no claims to Larry. By the way, they talked not only about the business topic, but also about everything. It turned out that Laurie was born and raised in this city, and once, almost 15 years ago, her parents, who had previously lived in Sweden, moved here because the family had roots here. When she learned that Geoffrey was studying to be a jeweler, Laurie laughed and said it was a funny coincidence, almost because she had already studied to be a geologist and dreamed of devoting her life to precious and ornamental stones. "Have you got a boyfriend?" Geoffrey suddenly blurted out. "You ask too many questions for someone I hit with a car." Larry wagged her finger at him, and then suddenly got serious and answered. "No, and I'm not ready for a relationship yet. Love, it's too complicated. First you need to stand firmly on your feet, to live for yourself, and then already let another person into your life." "That makes sense," Geoffrey nodded, his hair reddening. "I asked you that, by the way, without thinking. I'm not hitting on you. Look, I'm getting discharged tomorrow," he sighed. "On the daily I still prolonged, I'll lie there, then I'll look at other apartments, well, to rent for a long time. In general, thank you for offering moral compensation and all that, but I cannot agree to it. Thank you for giving me more money for treatment. And so, my father will send me, I'm fine, I'll hold out. But he will send in 3 days only. I've already paid for the apartment for these days. In general." Geoffrey again sighed. "Honestly, I have only 500 rubles in my wallet. Can you pay for a cab to get me to my apartment? I'm afraid I'll have a hard time taking public transportation. My back hurts." "I'll drive you," she said, and hastily, noticing how Geoffrey's eyes rounded, added, "Not me, but my father. He can take you in the car. I won't drive again for a while, I'm afraid. Also, I've been thinking. Well, since you're a little short on money then. You know, my dad's at the country house. An old country house, built in the 50s or even earlier. Maybe. Will you stay with us? Well, while you're recovering. Fresh air. And there's no worries, my dad has a woman working there. Tina's name is Tina. She's a great maid and cook. Anyway, I'm sorry I'm rambling, it's the first time it's happened. And with a car and a man. It's the first time." Geoffrey blurted out and then stopped talking, because the joke was stupid, inappropriate, and not about anything. Laurie looked at him in confusion too, and then for some reason they laughed together. "You agree, Guy," came the voice of a neighbor in the ward, 40-year-old metallurgist, who went to the hospital with an industrial injury. If in my 20s such a girl offered me a visit, I would fly like a dove if I didn't go." Geoffrey sighed. Maybe. It really wasn't such a bad option, was it? It had been a few days since he'd left his grandmother's apartment, by the way, and he thought that Liz must have cooled down enough to listen to him. And they had to talk. Judging by the way the half-brother and sister were behaving, it was urgent to rescue Grandma from their company. With Larry agreed that she would pick him up the next day in the morning. That evening, however, Geoffrey dialed Liz's number. He waited. He called back. But the caller was unavailable. His heart felt uneasy, and he dialed Maggie's number. She seemed a little more human to him than Sami's brother. "She's not here." Maggie blurted out with an intonation that betrayed confusion, indignation, and deep drunkenness. "She's gone, the old fool." "Where?" asked Geoffrey. "How should I know?" Maggie shrieked. "We caught her in the driveway. She got in the car with some guy, a man in a suit, and said that she was going on vacation. And we. She said that she was tired and needed to think about everything. That man is a bore, said that we do not think." "How did he say?" Intrigue. No, can you imagine?" Geoffrey had no idea. Rubbing the bridge of his nose nervously, he didn't know what to think. Who and where could quiet, timid Grandma Liz have gone? What if, exhausted by the bad company of her grandchildren, she'd gotten involved with some kind of crook, cult, black realtor? Geoffrey felt a pang of guilt. He was good, too. He should have realized what rotten people his brother and sister were, and he should have been more decisive, should have talked to Liz instead of not scheming himself. By the way, Maggie continued in a stuttering voice. "What's the word, intrigue, huh?" "I have no idea," Geoffrey smirked, though of course he knew the meaning of the word perfectly well. Bye, then. And he ended the conversation. He was in a state of shock. Where could Grandma Liz have gone? And with whom? Why wasn't she answering his calls? In fact, Joffrey realized with his mind that she had probably not yet discovered that something very important to her was missing, her main jewel, namely gold. Yes, Joffrey had left his grandmother's apartment for a reason. A couple of days before Liz had thrown him out in a scandal, he had taken advantage of her absence. She had been with Maggie and Sami at the clinic to go into her room, and knowing perfectly well where the treasure chest had been kept all these years, had taken it out. He opened it, put the gold in a box, and put it in his inconspicuous sports traveling bag. In place, that is, at the bottom of the chest, put a note in which he explained everything as it is. Mole, I'm taking this, grandmother, to save for you, because your grandchildren relatives are already thinking about how to divide it. In general, Joffrey, when all this was arranged, hoped that he would be able to personally with his grandmother to talk about all this before she noticed the disappearance of gold jewelry. After all, he knew for a fact that she had not touched them for years, and therefore theoretically she should not have noticed that they were missing. But anything could have happened. And now Joffrey wondered, and if she had found out that they were missing, how had she reacted? Did she believe what he said in the note? Just words, with no proof that he was right? Or did she curse him as a dishonorable thief? Or maybe Granny had already filed a complaint against him. But Joffrey thought if the latter was true, they would probably have found him in the hospital by now and come to him here. So where was the truth? And who the hell had taken his grandmother away, and where? On the day he was discharged from the hospital, Joffrey was worried sick. His own consent seemed to him a rash folly. After all, he hardly knew Larry at all, and he had already accepted an invitation to visit her at home. And not even at home, but at her country cottage. But on the other hand, why would she plot something evil against him? It's more like she's trying to make it up to him for hitting him with her car. The day he was discharged from the hospital, Larry and her father came to pick him up. Vincent, a solid-looking man in a suit, shook Joffrey's hand and said he sympathized with him and was grateful that he had agreed to a peaceful resolution to the whole thing. Yes, it was nothing, replied Joffrey with a look as if his cars were being hit on a weekly and regular basis. From the hospital, they went first to a rented apartment. They had to pack their things, which, fortunately, were few. Unnoticed by his new acquaintances, Joffrey poked his hand into the bag with the gold. The box with it seemed to be still inside. The jewelry rustled if the bag was shaken. On the way to the cottage, we got to talking to Vincent. It turned out that he is engaged in honey business. He said that he owns several apiaries, supplies bee products to many stores, and in general does not regret that he settled here. Because here is his real home. Here has felt some special, almost mystical connection with the ancestors. My father is thinking of coming here this year, too, Vincent said, for a visit. I don't want to disturb. Well, I mean, it's a family atmosphere, and here's a stranger. It's all right, Vincent smiled, but I must warn you. Besides me and Tina and you, there will be one other person living at the cottage, a pensioner, an old acquaintance of my father's. That's all right, said Joffrey. I have a grandmother myself. Larry said you had a fight with her? Vincent grinned. Generational differences? Something like that, Joffrey said, not wanting to be privy to any personal squabbles. Family circumstances, he said, staring thoughtfully out the window at the summer scenery and planning how to look for Granny, because of course he couldn't leave it at that. Wow. That was all Joffrey could say when the cottage appeared in front of them, when they drove through the pine grove. At first sight it was clear it was an unusual place, which seemed to exist in some detachment from the surrounding, mundane world. The two-storied building reminded of a harem, as it is often depicted in Russian fairy tales, but at the same time it was felt that everything here was thought out for the comfort, modern convenience of the inhabitants. The lower floor was flanked by a veranda, partly glazed, partly open, with a railing and columns covered with skillful carvings and covered with some curly and lushly blooming plants. Welcome, Vincent smiled as Joffrey got out of the car. Here's our family, and here's our guest. From the porch of the house came a short, plump, but clearly full of vitality woman of about 50, dressed in a brightly colored dress. You are, of course, Joffrey, she smiled broadly at the boy, introduced herself as Tina, and taking him firmly under her arm and even hugging him around the waist. led him toward the house. "I'll make you some tea now. How do you feel about raspberry jam? I made a pie with it. There's also fish pie. And soup. Cabbage salad with carrots and apple. Oh, careful, the step is sagging here, it should be fixed. Don't worry, I've prepared a bedroom for you downstairs. You're in no condition to run up and down stairs, are you?" Tina was still talking, and Joffrey couldn't get a word in edgewise. Vincent and Larry laughed at the encounter. Vincent carried Joffrey's bags into his room, and Larry joined Tina in talking about the cottage and its surroundings. "And now we have a surprise for you," Vincent said abruptly, as the little group made their way to what he said was the veranda at the back of the house, where the tea table was set. A surprise? It wasn't that Joffrey didn't like surprises, but he'd never been spoiled with them in his life, and he hadn't realized what there might be. And then when he stepped out onto the veranda and saw who was standing in front of him, he was speechless. "Grandma?" Liz smiled at her grandson and opened her arms to him, and he, still not too sure of the reality of the surrounding reality, stepped towards her. Grandma, but what are you doing here? And you?" Joffrey swallowed hard and looked into the old woman's eyes. They were warm, tender. "Have you forgiven me, Grandma?" "How could I not, grandson?" she said, and stroked his head, ruffling his already unruly hair. "I think you have a lot of questions." Joffrey nodded, but before he could say a word, Tina intervened, saying that it was best not to eat on an empty stomach, and that everyone should sit down and she would serve the pies and everything. Joffrey talked himself into taking his time, if only out of respect for the owners of the house, whose identity he was now much more concerned about, and indeed drank a cup of tea, ate a little something. And then finally Liz spoke. And to begin with, she spoke briefly about how she had met Alex in her youth, how fate had divided them, and how then, lo and behold, just the other day she had realized it was time to turn to him. It turned out that Alex couldn't help her so quickly. If he wanted to, he was far away vacationing at a resort, but he could entrust the care of an old friend to his son Vincent. "I almost went crazy when I saw him." Liz smiled. "He looks just like his father when he was young. Oh, if I weren't so old, I'd be madly in love," she said, and laughed. Liz hastened to tell Joffrey that she had overheard the whole sordid, dirty conversation between her blood grandson and granddaughter, which had opened her eyes to many things. And then, when she read Joffrey's note, a lot of things came together for her. "You know, the day after I called Alex, I went to the clinic with Sami," Liz said, "and when I got home, I saw that my room had been turned upside down. Maggie said she wanted to tidy up my room, and her eyes were running around. I knew right away it wasn't true. She's never been used to cleanliness or order, and the way everything was torn through, I realized what she really wanted. She was looking for gold." And then, a few days later, Liz said, growing sad, "Sami came to me. He had been drinking heavily. He started asking me how I was, how old I was, had I already written a will for my grandchildren. I told him to stop saying such things, but he got angry. Believe me, he pushed me so hard that I fell. What a bastard." Joffrey almost jumped up from the table, as if he were going to run to his brother to punch him in the face. Maggie calmed him down. Liz continued. "I was shaking all night. I had a chair against the door. But if they'd wanted to break in, the chair wouldn't have stopped them. In the morning, Sami apologized. Maggie begged for her brother. Well, I pretended that everything was fine, that I didn't hold a grudge. I really don't hold a grudge," Liz shrugged. "What good is anger? It just eats away at your soul like rust. I decided I couldn't stay in my own house with them anymore. And then Alex talked it over with his son, and Vincent offered me a place to stay while everything was sorted out. Grandma, I always knew." Joffrey started to speak fervently, but then, pulling himself together, he continued more calmly. "I always thought Maggie and Sami weren't the most decent people. I'm sorry." "It's all right," Liz sighed. "Life happens. I'm lucky to have one grandson. A real one."